empty, but you get there. I have a lot of friends that spend thousands of people.
Okay. Time to get started. Second day of signing talk. And with an early start, I'm sure
So, this is I'll be fairly transparent. This is a reasonably thrown together talk, so there's been quite a lot of stuff to sort out this week, but hopefully you'll find it of interest. Okay. So, starting off simply, what are consumer data? So I'm going to talk a little bit about Consumer Data Research Centre, what consumer data are, and then some of the example ways in which we use data from the service during the period of COVID response, particularly in the early stages of COVID. And this will be a slightly different flavour to some of the things that Mark kind of described before. So we think about what consumer data are. They're essentially very, very broad. So in the morning, you get up, you might drive, take your children to school. You could be getting picked up on a kind of camera where your number plates recognise the car flow through particular localities. In the UK, when you go to school, all of the children's records, where the parents live, what subjects the children do, how their attainment is structured, all sit within national databases, and they can be linked through time. And we can even take data like that and link it right through to employment market outcomes at the university. And you might go to work using a kind of ticketing system to get through a sort of a transport system, which is London's Oyster card system. Although you can use any kind of touch credit card on that now, and it can track flows of people for a city. If we're using kind of mobile phone apps, maybe navigating or doing a bit of shopping, they're collecting data. Again, could be geospatial, could be your location. Might be purchasing things in shops at lunchtime. Often shop because spend against kind of consumer ID, not give you sort of select offers for those. So these are just examples of those cards in the UK. Later on, you might have an appointment at the hospital. You call an Uber. So your Uber, they know where they pick you up, they know where you've dropped off. But actually, also the other interesting thing I found about Uber is all of the map infrastructure they've got to supply those routes. The large content companies like Apple and Google actually own the data that goes through those systems as well. So they also collect all that data too. Like schools, hospitals, doctors, they all collect sort of data about the interactions with the health service. Again, sort of picking up on stuff that Ian was talking about yesterday. But at the end of the day, you do some online shopping, like physical retailers in store. Those spend can attract and link to the individuals. Sometimes the online and offline stores are kind of connected together, sorry. And then even if you want to kind of relax at the end of the day, you're generating more data, maybe watching Netflix, maybe Patrick was watching The Crown last night. He was a real sort of staunch royalist, and now he's in this new category for that for Netflix. But generally, essentially, all these different companies are very disparate locations. It generates more of this data and producing insights about you all the time. I'll get into the ethics of all of that, but essentially, this is what's happening, and this is when we talk about consumer data, all of these things. So the TDFD model was that we have data owners and we have potential research users. And we work with these different data organisations through a whole variety of different mechanisms to kind of spend some time building up trust. It takes a long time to build up that trust. We have to try and find ways in which we can motivate those engagements. We do small projects, PhDs, master's projects, and then we have to be able to give them assurances that we're going to be looking at that data in a sort of safe way. So we have legal frameworks, secure data services, so forth. For the research users, to enable people to use these kind of data fluidly, we have a kind of a secure and very efficient kind of data service that we've had over the past 10 years. We put a lot of effort into making the data discoverable. So we have these maps platform, we have a data platform, and we're very interested in this idea of analysis-ready data. So we take the large data, which might be difficult to complex to use, we try and extract some information out of that and make it simple to use for the end users. So, why is consumer data, or why has consumer data been useful for the COVID response? Well, it's been very timely. So, If you're, like Ian was saying yesterday, if you're interested in real-time policy response, consumer data could be quite helpful in that, or in terms of sort of evaluation of the impact of particular interventions. You can augment things that you don't necessarily know about, so that could be enhancing sort of the geographic granularity of the things that you can find out about. So it's richer data, and they can also potentially tell you things that you can't know from any other source. It's kind of a unique, as a unique measure of some actual individuals. So as I say, the rest of the talk is just a series of different things that we've used in have been useful in COVID in terms of policy response. The first of these actually is now a sort of historic data set, because all of these sensors actually died during COVID. These previously were sat within shop windows all over the UK, and they monitored footfall as you went through sort of systems. This was March 2020, and this is what was happening in footfall in sort of British high streets, and you can see that year on year footfall has just gone down. It's not really very interesting. You know, there's lots of lockdowns and disruption, people went out to shops, but that's not really interesting. So if you actually look at how these changes, if you change it to week on week footfall, so you look at kind of rolling averages, what you find is that the data are quite sensitive to pick up different policy interventions. So when we had a full lockdown, there was a very steep decline in footfall, and as policy was adapted, we had this sort of period of stay alert where you could go about, but you had to watch out for the virus or something. It was very confused, which meant that more people were walking, and you could actually see there was a slight shift, and people started to interact more. So the non-essential retail opened, that's things, originally it was just things like supermarkets were open. The non-essential retail would be things that were in a class of retail that's classed not essential. You know, big spike in sort of footfall. Plus hairdressers, they opened up as keen interest at the start, which tapered, and then there was a scheme which actually really soon came up with Leeds to help out, and the idea there was like vouchers to get people to go back to restaurants, and it was kind of an economic stimulus, and that again had a kind of effect all these centres. So that was one piece of work that we did, and one of the things that we found it quite useful for is particularly around the heat act. It was around the heat act help out period of time. There was this curfew introduced in city centres where at 10 o'clock you were supposed to be off the street and back home, and pubs were going to close. And there was different opinions of whether that works or not. So there was this view that essentially it was sort of killing off hospitality because it was really constrained, and then others was how it was there was other opinions which it was having the opposite effect. So because there was this deadline, people were out on the streets partying beyond where they should be, and it was actually worse than having them in a controlled environment in a pub. So we thought, oh, that's just quite interesting. So we had a specific look at this. So we took two places. This is Leamington Spa, not well regarded sort of party town. It's supports a traditional little town, and actually the policies seem to work quite well. So we've got a 10 PM curfew, no curfew. We've got the distribution of the footfall over time. There's 24-hour periods, and what we found is that when you've got the 10 PM curfew, there was slightly higher rates of footfall before 10 PM because people were as the policy apply. We're gonna have to go over. Yeah, because the policy apply. There's more people leaving earlier, and it's actually quite sensible. The opposite of the case is that in Manchester, which is the picture you saw on that slide, and basically at 10 o'clock, it all gets very busy and everyone's out on the street running, which is not ideal. So again, quite an interesting kind of barometer on, you know, what you can measure through sort of consumer data. Another one which we did was we've got this global database of bike share scheme data, as we look at how many bikes adopt and move between different locations. Ironically, the Liverpool one now, which is the photo here, is now defunct, so we don't extract it, but they exist certainly in London and lots of other places. And early on in the pandemic, the Cabinet Office was scrapping out the data, so much like the slides I've just shown you, we look for ways of measuring the impacts of the policies. So actually what we did was we looked at, I think this one is this is the commuting. So We divided the bike data into two blocks, like commuting times, non-commuting times, or commuting times and leisure. This is commuting, and what we find is in the when lockdown happens, you might expect people didn't go to work, just work shop, massive fall in use, and then as those restrictions relax, commuting still goes up. These fed into some of the natural statistics that you saw on an easy each day, important measure of mobility. And then this is weekend holiday use. And again, this is quite interesting. So the bike share, when people did go to work, they were using it more for kind of leisure purposes. And we saw a kind of decline, and then when people's like serious lives and work started happening again, leisure use kind of comes to decline. So again, it was quite interesting barometer, and it was sort of useful for kind of measuring the policy outcomes. And then just briefly on this, we did some other work using different types of mobility data, these app-based data. And this is some work that my colleague James Cheshire did, and it was in the Financial Times. And this was looking specifically at those groups of people and their ability to isolate. So people were essentially told to stay in their homes during lockdown. Some people were given kind of a pass to go and work because they worked in kind of industries that needed to stay open, like trains, supermarkets, hospitals, those kind of fire services. But there was a donkey to that, and this was looking at that, and it was basically saying that not everywhere or not all people had the same ability to stay at home and keep themselves safe. And then there was also this issue of lockdown fatigue, where there was kind of an increasing prevalence of people breaking the rules, and we're actually able to detect that from these data. And then the final slide, or final two slides, an idea of essentially we've got, I think it was mentioned yesterday, it's sort of this internet user classification of internet use. And one of the things which it wasn't used for, which it had been used for, was the very first app that we introduced with the idea of a contact-facing app. So you can spoke to people with COVID, you know that, and you can take appropriate action. They tested it in the Isle of Wight. Now, in the Isle of Wight, if you look at our internet user classification, this is one of the main populated areas there. It really doesn't have very high engagement with people who use the internet, so there might not be very high use of different apps or particular engagement in this policy intervention. And actually, they really struggled to get the rate of participation for this up. In fact, in the end, this whole idea was scrapped. They went to a completely different system, which I think Silicon Valley came up with. So this is an example of how that could have been useful, but wasn't. So that's it. Oh, I've got a little animation. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions for Alex?
I'll kick off. Alex, where do you see kind of COVID is sort of situating the future of things like the CDRC? Has it strengthened validity of things like the CDRC for the future? Is it going to help with the digital footprints case in the future, do you think? Or?
I think it's provided a number of very strong cases of why there's policy value in those data. I still feel as though it's a huge variety of things to work on. And I think the other thing is that consumer data is not a static entity. There's a political economy to it, and even you can see this with things like Twitter, for example, in the past week. Over the course of a week, I don't know, if there was any value in Twitter data, hugely eroded, or it's now split between multiple networks. Other issues like the use of mobile phone app data. I mean, the pains of that as much as anyone having used them recently. It's really problematic, and it's going to be increasingly problematic as kind of disclosure control and stuff gets tightened up. So whether the things that we've demonstrated value on in the past will be used to demonstrate value in the future is a kind of moot point. I'm not totally sure, but there's definitely stuff there. But the key to, and why I always say initiatives like CDRC are important, is that you've got to have that kind of tacit knowledge and infrastructure to actually make any kind of insights out of this. We've been doing it for decades, pretty much, and we will have done by the time the funding finishes. That's kind of why we think it should continue in the future. There's a lot of knowledge there.
Any other questions?
What about any, do you see any new forms of data coming on stream? It's done work with the oyster cloud system and.
Satellite data. It's not new, but the methods you can use on those data. I think there's a lot of new insights that you derive from that. I think that's the most exciting area, to be honest. Because the variety of data is growing. If I wanted a job now in the satellite industry, would be where I'd be looking. It's very, very exciting.
I think your consumer database is really great, and we really want to have such data. But in terms of the temporal comparison, those data is kind of used for the old years. The data quality is not good, and it may getting better. I mean, we have that kind of issues with the private sector or big data. So how do you guarantee the quality of data over the time period?
It's a good question, and it isn't always as simple as older data are worse than new data. And actually, we've got data sets which are older, which are actually much better because there were fewer controls on. The mobility data is the most interesting example because when platforms like Google, who supply Android, introduce new features, or iOS introduce this MAC address scrambling so that you stop being able to count as accurately. They're more recent innovations, but Patrick and I, well, Patrick mainly has done this paper recently where we've been grappling with this issue, and it's, there isn't a way, because you can't correct for stuff, you can't correct for those kind of things, really. But I think that the only way, but certainly for things that you are, it's kind of new knowledge that you don't know from any other sources. My preference is that we're just honest in how we report that and make it as transparent as possible. And where you can add confidence intervals around your estimates, all those kind of things, you should do that. But there isn't a simple answer. Although, there is the argument to say that, the more data you collect, if you can use that creatively, you can fill some of the past problems data away. So we have a link to registers, and we, for example, we won't necessarily have records of people for all years, but if we know that someone lived in a property in the property this year, maybe there was 2 gaps, but they were still in the property for another year, we'll do things like backfilling those. Like being honest with the quality of the data, we're honest about how we've modeled those features backwards as well. So I think, I suppose, the simple answer is to try and be as transparent as possible in what you're doing. But it doesn't necessarily help you with review as well.
No.
Great. We can move to our next speaker now. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a PhD student here in the lab, in case anyone missed the introduction. But today, what I'm going to present is very preliminary, as in I've probably done like a week's work on the COVID part. But the overall project is understanding the impact of COVID-19 and Brexit on inflows of national students in the UK universities. And the Brexit part of it, I've done quite a lot of work on, but I'm really trying to now think about how I can control the COVID in some of these relationships.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to run through what the contents of the presentation are going to be. So I'm going to provide a bit of context on my PhD, as well as the research context for this the context of this research. I'm going to talk about the aims and objectives, the data, the methods I've used so far, and just some preliminary results. So you can't read the whole thing, but my overall PhD project is predicting demand for UK higher education within the global higher education market, and I'm partnered with UCAS, who are the UK Colleges of Admission Service. I'll talk a little bit more about the data I get from them in a bit. But the idea of my PhD is to have these sort of 3 papers that look at the past, so understanding the flows of international students between 2009 and 2019, the present, which is this, where we look at Brexit and COVID, and then go on to predict these flows. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking a bit about this paper. So I first just wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean by when we talk about international students. And there's a UNESCO definition, but this goes from 2015. And the idea is basically that they had to cross an international border between 2 countries with the sole purpose of participating in higher education. And the destination country has to be different from their origin country. But obviously this definition is slightly problematic in light of the pandemic, because we have people studying online and not actually cross the border. And also the focus of the study is students studying full-time degrees in the UK, so not Erasmus or exchange students who come for like a couple of months, so they are known as credit mobile students. So just a bit of context on the UK as a destination. The UK is the 2nd largest destination for international students in the world. And there was a lot of narrative around the idea that COVID-19 was going to create a disruption to the flows of international students that were able to attend UKHE. And prior research, mainly by me, has shown that Brexit has a large negative impact on inflows of new students. But these things are happening at the same time. Like you have the end of free movement as a result of Brexit in January 2021, and then you've got COVID kind of going on during this whole period. So we really need to think about how we can understand these 2 things together. So yeah, so that kind of just to reiterate what I said, I really want to control the impact of COVID on international student flows into the UK. But one of the problems I have is my data is relatively static. So I can just look at one time period, basically like the number of students each year that enter from an origin country into the UK. And COVID is obviously very dynamic, as we've discussed in this, like in the throughout all the sessions here today. So I'm really looking for ideas and feedback on how I can model this better and how we can start to look about these things more accurately. So just to give a bit of an idea of what these flows look like, sorry, the thing is different, but this is flows of international students between 2009 and 2021 for the academic year that just ended. And you can see that the big decline is actually EU students in the 21-22 academic year. That's where you really see massive changes. But there is some fluctuation here, but actually the flows don't really change as a result of Brexit. As a result of the end of, as a result of COVID. But if you look at this, looks at visas, your accepted visas for travel in 2022 massively collapsed. So you've got this dual thing where applications and acceptances didn't really change, but the actual amount of people coming to physically study at the UK did change. So you've got all these dynamics going on at once. So this is just a little bit about my prior work on the impact of Brexit, just to provide a bit of context. So the group, so this is just a difference analysis, but this red line is representing the decline in actual EU students to the UK, and the difference in different measure there is again the negative impact as a result of Brexit. So it has had the end of free movement has had a really huge impact on EU international students, and probably more than it appears COVID has. But we're here to talk about COVID. So my primary data source is from the UK Colleges Admission Service, UCAS, and they act as the main route of applications for students wanting to study at a UK higher education institution. They only account for students that use their services, which was about 95% of EU entrants and 60% of non-EU entrants in 2019, which is a fairly big chunk, but it's not everyone. And for this research, I wanted to corroborate this UCAS data with other data resources to measure inflows of international students. So as well as the UCAS data, I'm also going to look at the visa data, which is accepted applications for student visas. I'm also going to look at data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, which measures the number of registered students on the 1st of December of the academic year. Just so that's actually more like who is actually there. Whereas the data from UCAS looks at who's applied and who accepted a place at UK institution. And then I'm going to also look at the COVID stringency index, which has been spoken about in a couple of presentations here today, and the COVID cases per million of the population as well. So that's to do with the origin countries. So yeah, this is like my very sort of thrown together methodology, which definitely needs work. But for this, I just narrowed the focus to 2020. Whereas my previous research just took like a more of a longer, like bigger time span. And I want to identify, because I want to identify a time period where international students will be accepting their offers from UCAS, which is another complicated decision because basically the way it works is about May or June time, you then say, yeah, I will actually come to the UK and I'm going to accept this offer. Well, I'm going to accept this offer at a UK institution. But that is kind of imperfect as well. So I've kind of just taken an average of the stringency of the origin country for those 2 months, as well as the average number of cases per million, but it's really not capturing like the dynamic nature of COVID. And then I want to incorporate these measures into a model to see the impact on student numbers. So because the data is skewed, I'm going to use negative binomial regression modeling as it's much better able to handle this kind of data. So I'm going to present the results from a suite of hierarchical models, which are very preliminary. And I want to aim to understand the impact of COVID stringency and COVID cases on international student numbers in the UK, just to get an idea of, is there anything going on here? So these are my very basic results, but so first looking at stringency. So as people described yesterday, it's on a scale of 0 to 100, and basically I have about 150 origin countries in this data set, I think, and I've just like applied like how stringent COVID restrictions were in that country during that time period. So you can see that in terms of the UCAS data, application data, UCAS acceptance data, and PISA data, increased stringency has led to reduced student flows, or increased visas, which I don't really understand. And then COVID cases per million kind of has like a bit of an opposite effect. So where COVID cases were higher, there's more applications and acceptances. So this is something I don't really understand. And I think it's part of this idea that maybe, I don't know, maybe the narrative is that people still were like, I'm going to come and apply for a degree because COVID might be over, or you've got to think of the narrative at this time. Everyone was like, I think it'll be back to normal by September, so just come. I think universities are really pushing that narrative. So there's a lot of contextual stuff around this. But this is basically what I've got so far, and I'm just trying to think of a way that I can incorporate this into my wider research about the impact of Brexit as well. So yeah, to summarise, work in progress. The links aren't completely clear. Higher stringency does seem to reduce flows. However, higher COVID cases don't seem to reduce flows as much. I'm still looking for a way to figure this all out. So next step might be to impact some additional control variables. I also need to extend these analyses into the 2021-22 academic year, and then also consider stringency cases at different time periods. So yeah, thank you.
Vaccines?
Yeah, probably. I mean, like I said, that a week in total on this is probably a good idea.
Because I reckon that would have, so I think the stuff about cases is interesting. Because if you're kind of fully vaccinated, you're probably not bothered about that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't worry you.
Because I'm trying to think of that as well, because this is like 2020, so like say what, we went into lockdown in March. So this is the immediate May after that when there was no vaccine.
You're vaccinated by then.
But the following academic year,
You
where
would.
we were still,
Yeah.
then you would start to see the vaccine numbers. That's lovely. Yeah. But,
So, I mean, there's a lot of unknown stuff that you probably won't be able to get at, because there's, you know, attitudinal stuff about the context you won't get at from these numbers. You'd have to go and interview someone or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting.
I'm very confident. Well, I was just thinking, so the ability to work fully remotely may have had very different effects on sort of local students compared to international students. I don't know if you, so in your last analysis you looked at UCAS applicants, is that sort of globally?
Yeah, it's just non-UK domiciled students.
All non-UK, and it had a positive effect. So there was more applicants, even though COVID was.
Yeah, so I don't know what it is. Or just not.
Yeah, sorry, but that potentially is more willingness to work remote, like you could work from your home country. Is that something you?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Sort of context around this, right? Because like maybe that wasn't actually a really big deterrent. Maybe they were like, that's fine, I'm happy to do that for a year.
But like, it would mean you wouldn't even have to travel to the country to study, and that may have
But
a
you
positive
would
effect.
years of
Okay.
degree. It's kind of like, okay, the degree starts with 2020, but the idea would be, you might be like, oh, you probably aren't going to do the whole 3 years.
Yeah.
Online. I think it is a good point. I think it's like part of the consideration for stuff.
Yeah, I just wondered about so you commented on the positive relationship between COVID cases and new classification.
Mhm.
Is that cases in the destination?
In the origin country. And because I've got this, like, again, I think it would be interesting to include something about the UK as well. But I just I've done one destination country and one time period at the moment, so I wasn't sure how useful it would be. But maybe it'd be like a relative case thing might be.
Yeah. You can take a look at the two.
This part of the presentation?
Yeah, I think that's.
This is good. We put today, just to try to get that wrong. I think it was fine. We did say Thursday morning. It's all up in the line.
Yeah.
That's well done.
So it's time for a government more to see.
Go for it. I'll hit one after. Okay, probably my question is probably the same as you have. But I'm just wondering whether they can offer a kind of working permit visa as well, because after graduation, probably some folks wanted to go back to their country, some folks wanted to remain and stay more in this country, but I think COVID may affect some kind of their decision after graduation, whether they stay here. I'm just.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually a point because the visa days was only something I've been recently working with. And you have visas to study and then visas to extend your stay.
Right.
And it's not something I've looked at yet, but it might be an interesting thing to consider as well. So yeah, thank you.
Because some of my friends in the other country, they being forced to stay there, the country instead of come back because situation is kind of complex and they believe that once they left the country, then probably they will gonna, it's no other chance to come back again.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think like one of the largest, I don't know too much about the context in China, but one of the largest senders to the UK is Chinese people, and they have some of the most restrictive COVID policies in terms of coming and going. So there probably is like a dynamic. Yeah.
I was going to ask Ruth about what was the time period again that you're studying? It's 1 year, is it?
Yes.
Okay, so I was thinking, because generally what you'll see with like 2020 is that cases aren't as high as you probably expect because they haven't been collected properly at that point. So you're not going to have as linear a relationship probably as you thought you might. Whereas if you looked at, say, like Christmas of that year, you might see it. But then again, that's when the UCAS acceptances aren't happening.
2021, you academic year, because you'd be applying
Exactly.
November to January and then you accept May to June.
Exactly.
So if you think about 2020, you've only really got this May, June book for the next year.
And then the other thing you'll see is in that same time period, you'll have Delta, which will be interacting with that as well. So probably that will be contributing to a lot of that decision-making process as well, because stringencies just jumped back up again, didn't they? So
Yeah.
but definitely worth checking the 2 years because 2020 is just a bit of an unusual one for cases.
Yeah, and like one of the reasons why I just did 2020 for this is because in 2021 then you've got like this whole Brexit thing as
Yeah,
well.
of course.
So it's just like a lot of things happening in that year. But yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Okay, so we can move to our next speaker.
recognize presence in time. I mean, I usually don't use the script, but 10 minutes is too short.
Oh, I don't have the science. I mean, yeah.
We had that secret for morning, actually we've got four, so, if you.
It might slow.
I think that.
I can make it.
Got some odds like running.
Set 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes.
Struggling with your slide.
Okay. That's where the actual time comes out.
Might have to just leave it. If you press the button now, it's like, hey. Yeah, is that okay? I can't get it. Good.
After, maybe you could just like pull the window to the left, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah. Well, yeah, okay, cool, we'll say that. Great.
Hey everyone, my name is Stefan. Now, according to research, it's a very older question. I mean, in Korea, nobody cares about just enjoy the park weekend. But anyway, so here I implemented some new method. I combine several methods together and make the policy out the politician. I think the measures that help to decide certain levels of outcome social level. So briefly, I talk about, I mean, everyone knows that COVID, like the previous coronavirus, COVID-19, characterized by mutations in the spike that come into contact with the respiratory epithelial cells resulting in high transmission rate, rapid worsening of the symptoms, and rapid spread throughout the whole. Also, COVID-19 has spread all over the world. The health system and quarantine policies in different countries have made a big difference in the rate of increase and decrease in the number of confirmed cases and also serious deaths. The initial strict lockdown policy drastically reduced the people's mobility, slowing the spread of COVID-19. However, lockdown policy was lifted in stages due to the various socioeconomic side effects caused by the post-prolonged lockdown. Korea has implemented social distancing as a policy in response to COVID-19 and has suggested precautions to be also provided individual facilities and in workplaces. In accordance with the standards for limiting the spread of infectious disease and the occurrence of confirmed cases, we are implementing step-by-step preventive measures such as social distancing in advance. The traditional way to predict the spread of infectious disease is the mathematical model. A mathematical model refers to the description of the real phenomenon with the help of the mathematical expression. For the construction and simulation of such models, the application of the mathematical, statistical, and numerical calculation techniques is required. In a mathematical model, the most important indicator used to determine whether an infectious disease spread is the basic reproduction number, that is the number of secondary infections that first infected a person and goes on average. The SIR model, this is a representative mathematical model, predicts the macroscope change in the number of infected people over time by applying key parameters affecting the spread of the disease, such as infection and recovery rates, to an entire country or region. But in recent time, the development of a micro model is accelerating due to the development of computer technology and the explosive increase in the available data. For example, there is mobility indicators help explore especially different changes in mobility along with the time series change in daily life with COVID-19. Additionally, indicators for measuring the effectiveness of quarantine policies were developed. For example, OXCGRT, Oxford COVID-19 government response record provides a comprehensive stringency index based on the quantification of policy responses to compare various government responses to COVID-19. A general prediction of the number of confirmed cases has a limitation in that the quarantine policy cannot provide a spatial and temporal prediction that can be applied to a detailed spatial unit where an individual's real life takes place. So social distancing was initially applied to a wide range of regions and groups, which caused damage to the local economy and increased antipathy due to the continued control, thus increasing social stress. In the end, it is difficult to resolve the dissatisfaction of the general public subjected to social distancing, unless treatment for infected patients is generalized through the development and dissemination of therapeutic agents. Rather than predicting that the number of confirmed cases will reach thousands next week, it is more practical to suggest what social distancing policies will work in an area of interest. If the effects of the social distancing policies are presented in a detailed level in terms of time and space through science and methodology, it will be possible to reduce the antipathy toward social distancing and induce more active participation. Considering this, we propose a simulation method that can predict the effects of a government policy to prevent the spread of infectious diseases such as COVID-19 and drive the necessary future steps to improve the this is make the decision, but I will explain. The policy simulation model is figure first analyze the level change in social distancing, derive the cycle of major level change, and start by calculating the level frequency of domestic prevention policy. Using the epidemiological investigation data of Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency (KDCA), the number of confirmed cases by city, county, district, and the infection route is calculated. Using this data, the number of confirmed cases on a nationwide scale is predicted with a random forest model. That is a machine learning model. By imputing the expected number of confirmed cases nationwide into the distribution model, the number of confirmed cases by city, county, district, and the infection route is. Finally, by simulating the type and frequency of the prevention policy, the expected number of confirmed cases by region and by infection route is predicted. And through this, the effect of social distancing is compared by policy type, region level, and region. So that the data of the simulation model consists of 8 metrics consisting of time, x-axis, and 250 municipality, y-axis, and 8 government policy, z-axis, and 1 matrix of the number of confirmed cases. To demonstrate the simulation model of the COVID-19 prevention policy, first regular briefings by the Ministry of Health and Welfare change the social distancing system and level adjustment documents for each city, county, district, or collective, and organized authority. Based on the 8 detailed prevention policies from January 20th, 2020 to April 6th, 2021, in 2050 cities, counties, and the daily frequency was calculated by referring to the change in the level of social distancing and prevention policy. The number of confirmed cases was calculated using the data on the number of daily confirmed cases collected and managed by the KDCA during the same period. This table shows the attributes of the data. So I just used that 3 address and the amounts and the the method of predicting the national frequency of confirmed cases starts with the complex input variables using a random forest model and identifying the correlation between the variables. The random forest model adjusts the predictive power of the model while collecting and developing a set of causal relationship between the variables in an ensemble form. The number of confirmed cases by day, region, and infection route was assumed as a dependent variable, and the change in stringency of 8 policies by day and region was assumed as independent variable. The model for predicting the occurrence of confirmed cases was configured to calculate in terms of 1 week units from the 1 week average to the 4 week average. The distribution model was converted to be proportional to the ratio of the number of past confirmed cases in the city county district. In addition, the simulation process, including allocating the numbers of confirmed cases in consideration of the density of the possibility model. And we have a local data set. We have business data, learning possibilities, medical and all different businesses. So we use that the density of the possibilities in the relevant city counties. This is the Gangnam, you know, Gangnam style. You know, a lot of in possibilities that is adult and possibilities. So it's a lot of yeah. So I did some simple kind of case generation I assumed some numbers, it's a total nationwide stuff. But the scenario for the different distribution model assumes the number of confirmed cases nationwide at 2000 and the rates of frequency of restrictions on religious activity. My friend in Korea has a lot of church. It's very it's more than 700. I think it was 7 million in the project. Huge. That's a lot of churches and temples. We have also most of them. So, and rate the frequency of restriction on religious activity and restriction on workplace to level 5 and level 1. The number of confirmed cases by infection rate was predicted for both the restriction on religious activity and restriction on workplace. It was predicted that more than 95% of the total number of confirmed cases would occur intensively in the 4 infection routes: nursing facilities, medical institutions, religious facilities, and education. When the stringency was increased compared to the level 1, the occurrence was concentrated in medical institutions and nursing facilities. Very interesting result. So geographically, in the case of level 1 restriction on religious activity, a large number of outbreaks were expected to center of the metropolitan area. Maybe you're not familiar with it. It's the Seoul, an area, with some, and there's so forth. Also here is a Daejeon, I think here, some area. However, when the restriction on the religious activities raised to the level 5, the geographic scope of the outbreak area is limited. And it is predicted that the outbreak will occur on a fairly large scale in a small number of areas. The implication that can be drawn from the policy simulation model and demonstration first through the policy simulation, the importance of adjusting the social distancing level regardless of the type of prevention policy was present. For second, in order to increase the effectiveness of the preventive policies, the necessity of preparing flexible prevention policies in consideration of the actual condition of each region was informed by subdividing the factors that cause regional deviations. Finally, the discrimination model can support the predictions of the possible outbreak areas and the route of spread. It was confirmed that this model can support the transition from a response after an outbreak to a management system following a threat and response. In the future research, it is necessary to improve the predictive power and logical explanation of the simulation model. Further research on the simulation models and extensions of policies, I only consider the aim. Further, this also need considering the fact that COVID-19 related research is being conducted at various institutions. it is necessary to prepare an environment that comprehensively collects and shares infectious disease related data, analysis method, and results. Many institutes have their own research and we are not sharing kind of big issues, such as make one platform, share data and analysis. Finally, we have infectious data disease prevention and management act. It is necessary to prepare more detailed system to respond and manage the infectious disease using data analysis information and communication. During this research, we contact the agencies. So we started include special information when you do analysis or make a policy. So you should use the special information. And it is included in the plan. Thank you.
Any questions?
I find out so interesting. My main sort of click is this religious centers when you actually select stringency level 5. So because they're very religious across. Could you comment a bit more because it's not something that I typically think about.
Yeah, the religious facility is quite interesting. Because the Europe and even America is not even there's a Protestant country, but it's a young generation not going to church. But then in Korea, it's a kind of you should give their service someday. It's guarantee you go to the heaven. It's not. But the routine activity is very important. So sometimes at the first outbreak, there is a lot of churches. Ignore what the government said. It's better to you not going to church because there are two problems. So you just service at your home, but they don't. Risk. They go to the church and sing together and eat together, and then outbreak happens. So that's the kind of big issues, and then the characteristic is the same to the we adopt social distancing policy, is wear your mask. It's very hard for me. Why I should wear mask? Why you come from me? Like that. So location, information is very important, but big challenge for me is in Korea is Seoul is very centered and big cities that I have many different types of businesses, but Seoul has all large number of that facilities. But the local area, there's not many. So it's very hard to discern which facilities are more affected to the compound case. Big cities. Thank you.
I've got 1 minute. So, do you have any method to quantify the precision of your model?
Any more precise?
How precise is your model with your predictions?
Geographically or
Validation.
How do you validate your model?
This is we compare our result simulation to the real numbers. Because it's a past data set. So in the future we don't know, but our data set is January 22, 2020 and April 2021. But after that, there's a number, and there's some cases. So we can check this the county compound cases. We compare the simulation numbers with the real. Anyway.
Anyone else? Okay, then I think we have thing with patient. Our next speaker will be Patrick, but it's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
One of the speakers in the.
Is that all right?
Wasn't like PowerPoint. Just show it. No, we shouldn't have used that. Fine, you can do it. You don't get something that. This right about. Okay. See? Fun. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, good presentation so far. A lot of colorful graphics, you know. This is not one of those presentations. So what you probably see some stick figures inside here, sort of party. All right, so but hopefully it's interesting as it goes along. So one of the things that it's circulating, we've seen presentations on social media. There's a lot of people doing work on social media, and obviously there's a lot of people looking at vaccines. You know, the central premise of this is basically there some sort of research questions here where we could bridge the idea of understanding a bit more about vaccines and about people using social media. And I'll get to that. I just would like to sort of thank some of the contributors of this ongoing work. Pauline is in John Hopkins and Andre here, and two other colleagues, Ari Kreutero and KRIHS out in the US. So, COVID happened. Bunch of measures went in place. Social distancing, stay at home, this quite a lot that happened. But with all of these things, vaccination still proved to be more or less the most practical approach towards curbing the spread of the disease. All right. But easier said than done. All right. This is the idea where some people, they'll take a Panadol or they'll take some ibuprofen, but they won't take an injection, which, but so vaccine movement sort of came into play, and because sort of anti-vax movement came into play, and that just made things really difficult. All right. Because of that, there's a lot of sort of misinformation going in there, and that basically spread like wildfire. And this is what, one of the main challenges I would say in terms of vaccinations is really the anti-vax movement. So most of the sort of traditional way of collecting data, I think really good data is looking at surveys. So when you think about census data, for example, quite a lot of people going out there and collecting data. Unless those data sources, well, it's really rich, it's really costly. All right, logistically, it's a nightmare. All right, especially when you think about upscaling. So for really small little groups and stuff, it's fine. But for large groups, it's a problem. And when you think about census data, for example, every 10 years, right? So imagine doing something similar for any country, time, effort, money, and it's really just a nightmare. So social media, and the idea came into play just like we were looking at an idea and everybody was doing vaccines, so no, why not me? But everybody's using social media. Well, not everybody per se, but there's quite a lot of talk on social media. One of the things about social media is just that compared to your typical surveys, there's several different biases. And one clear bias is when you have a survey to do, you almost kind of push people into what's answering questions a certain way. Social media is kind of like it's a bit more open, right? So it's a rich source of the information. And because so many people are using it, how do we learn a thing or two about sort of vaccine hesitancy? All right. So that's what the central prompt in this. All right. How we use it as a survey tool, and specifically, we'll be looking at first trying to understand the different factors that could possibly lead to vaccine hesitancy, and two, how we trust the results. All right. Not a stick figure. Big sort of technical diagram, but it's not that technical. All right. So with this, go through like really quickly, summarizing different steps. A lot of these things are more or less straightforward, but the work here was done on 10 metropolitan statistical areas in the US. All right, and they're sort of listed out in this particular region. So, it doesn't care. But Atlanta, Chicago, and those are cities, but just kind of like the areas on the outside there. All right, and the reason we chose this is because, you know, economically, in terms of like jobs and stuff, they sort of group and class into this sort of, these sort of economics. All right. So what we did is basically we grabbed data from Twitter, and everybody knows using API and what you call it, using keywords. All right, and then basically put those to the 10 metropolitan areas. All right, that's how we collected the Twitter data here. With respect to getting the socio-demographic sort of characteristics of vaccine hesitancy, we just reviewed a bunch of papers, looked at what people were saying, and then we went out and tried to grab as much information as possible. All right, so that ended up in some data wrangling. We did some feature selection using as a main response variable estimated hesitancy rates from the HS survey, hesitancy household survey, right, which it was conducted by the US Department of Housing, all right, in this case here. And the feature selection, I mean, this is typical, looking at linearity, looking at non-linear relationships to get best sort of indicators or variables. What we did here is the HS survey has 5 hesitancy levels. So we built 5 models based on different combination of these factors, all right? Using an optimization model. And we'll take a look at that on the next slide. With respect to the model development, because what we're trying to do is just that, okay, we collected the data here, we understand the factors here, so the demographic factors, but what about really understanding sort of hesitancy within data? We need a training data set to basically build a model based on hesitancy, then be able to apply this to the Twitter data. What we did is we got some labeled Twitter data in respect to pro, anti, and neutral stances. And these were all collected from different sources and they were manually labeled. All right. We split that into test and training, and we use the BERT model here, BERT tweak. It's an English language model. All right. There are other models, obviously, but this is sort of work in progress. And we use a hypertuning approach using RayTube, which is a population-based scaling model approach. And we developed the model and we found the best model here. So now what we're saying here is that we have a model here that can basically predict these different levels of hesitancy. We get that model and then we take that, and from the socio-demographic variables here, from the data that we need classified, and the model here, what we're going to be doing is basically taking the Twitter data, taking this good model here that we found, basically applying it to the Twitter data, all right, doing some classifications there. And then what we're going to do, we're going to compare that to survey data. All right, so we use Delphi data from CMU Carnegie Mellon University. All right, and it's probably one of the better data sources in terms of survey. So there's a lot of QA and QC sort of controls inside it. And we more or less compare these together. And essentially, the models that we develop here, consider that the base model. What we're going to be doing inside here is basically taking survey data, fit that in the model, how much did it improve, right? You're going to do the same thing with Twitter data, substitute it in the model, see if it improved, and basically compare the results. The regression model here was basically using an 80-20 split of about 500 different splits randomly, right? And then took the average of that. So, some results. Out of about probably about 50 different indicators, it came down to about 10 different indicators across the 5 different socio-demographic factors. And these are just like broad things inside there. It's just like a long list. I just sort of summarized it here. Twitter data was about 5 million tweets that we used. That data was collected over a few years, so 5 million tweets across 10 of these regions. still quite a small number, but still big since it's these large sort of urban areas. The model was based on label tweets, pro, neutral, anti-vax, and these are the sort of numbers that go with it. And that equality model basically produced an score of 0.83. Now, is that a good thing? Well, most of the literature out there basically is around like 75 to like mid 75 to more or less like mid 70s to upper 70s. There are a few models out there that basically do pretty well. About 85, and there's one that actually said that 89. Problem with that is that the one that actually said 89, they said they made it, they never provided information on the model. Right, but 0.83 is good. It could be better, obviously, but it's sort of in line with what's already out there. All right. So that's it. That's sort of the model that we use there. So what did we find? Well, first off, this is sort of blocking stuff here, but these are the 5 hesitancy sort of groups. All right. Remember what we're doing is basically taking the base model here, which is just the demographic factors. One case was in put the survey data. Did we improve? All right. Then we replace that with Twitter data. Did we improve? So what we found was it's pretty interesting. So obviously, survey data did improve the results. It got better. All right. Compared to the Twitter data, well, it wasn't that off. It was probably within about 10% difference. All right. So when you saw that, if you look at it like specific values here, 0.82 with the Twitter data added, 0.91 with the survey data. If you look at here, 0.81 with the Twitter data added, 0.88 with the survey data. That's not too bad. All right. I mean, I just understand there's reasons for that, right? Because it's Twitter versus survey data. Also really interesting is just that the mean squared error compared to like the baseline model, Twitter did improve that. Obviously the survey data did it a lot better, and you can see the values here, but it did have some improvement on the mean square error values. All right. So the big picture, I think it was more or less obvious that the survey data would have performed better, right? That was kind of like, that was guessing, but I think we can appreciate that for different reasons, right? So social media is sort of fraught with different issues, representation, for example, all right? In terms of the urban divide, where the data is situated. The 1% or 1.5% or 3% of the geocoded, how many tweets are actually geocoded compared to the better population, the larger population. All right, even the geocoding, what do you think about it? All right, for example, if you put the US in Twitter, you basically get position in the geographic center in the US if you don't have like a much more higher fidelity location, right? So there's some issues with that as well. And obviously, in the end, could we trust the data itself? There's a lot of things with Twitter, and there's a lot of issues that's going on here. And there's been studies looking at the representativeness of this data, urban versus rural, and it's ongoing, but it's not going out there and talking to people and actually collecting this, right? The fact that you say something on Twitter does not mean in real life that you go out there and you do things like that, right? There's some crazy people across there. All right. But think about it. It takes so long and it costs so much to actually do these surveys. It's not like we're not going to keep doing them, just that compared to like an ACS survey in between where we can actually have little snapshots of kind of like the socio-demographics of the population. If we could use sort of auxiliary data like such as social media to even get an insight, we can create some sort of hybrid model to really understand what's happening in between these sort of larger collection events. That's actually, that's a win. Now, the accuracy wasn't as great as the survey data, but it's still a stepping stone, all right? So some of the things that we're looking at right now is that because this is sort of the aerial units were really large, one of the things we're thinking about, well, where are the areas of discrepancies? Where's the model failing at more granular levels? We're looking at larger, not necessarily regional, but bigger aerial units. But you know, if you can localize in some of these areas and really understand the socio-demographics there, right? Because kind of like bottom-up understanding what happens there, function leads to overall form, what happens above. The other thing too, it's really interesting too. The way we actually work with deep learning model, we just use the standard language model. All right. One we use is English, right? Book does a good job, but you know, we're thinking about sort of multimodal sort of models, and rather than just use like one layer within deep learning model, which is just the textual information, we can actually add associated demographic information within inside there and actually compare that to the regression model in the end and see, look at improvements. Obviously, looking at more local scales data, finding additional variable, and you know, one of the main sort of assumptions with this is just that if you look at the literature, there's this idea that you talk about something in social media, and it's an idea that you'll kind of be that person in real life. So the link here between kind of looking at vaccine hesitancy from a textual approach about what people say online does not necessarily have to correlate what happens on the ground. All right. So that's it's a limitation, but at the same time, it's a limitation that you have to appreciate because it's a starting point to actually sort of spite out and learn other things as we go on. And I think that might be it. 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I always hesitate to use social media data because the representative, I think it's I don't use I don't have a Facebook. I have an Instagram account, but I never use. So some people, don't use the social media, and there is a manipulation happened in Korea, like usually voting season, and there are no better things. That they just tweet or whatever on the Facebook. So the real, and the people in the social media, there's kind of a dimension. It's quite, I think there's a gap between the real people, what they think, and then, so how to, I think it's we find the gap is the good starting point, I think, but it's quite hard to the analysis, the result, from the social media that represents the real situation. I think. So
yeah, like comment on that. I fully agree. Just kind of like the idea of linking like reality to cyberspace. You know, what you are in like the cyber world. You know, somebody could be Batman out in Twitter, but then in reality they're like a dad basically. You know with a mini van. Kind of stuff like that. And you're right. And I think there's a lot of work being done there, but this again, I mentioned representation and trust. There's so much happening there, and I think it's a hard problem to crack. Just a generation that uses it now to just like a lot of the younger generation, and there's a little issues with that sort of generation as well. But the overall idea is just it's not to provide conclusive evidence. So one of the things that we have to realize with social media is that because it's something is spoken about, all right, it's not something that you could generalize to the population. It's opinion. And I see a lot of scientific articles. Oh, we got these results, and this is what everybody's saying. But no, it's opinion. So this is just basically really just trying to understand how public opinion could basically around vaccine hesitancy could probably open new doors to actually look at it from a different perspective. But again, to actually learn from that, and then the idea is basically drilling down, finding more evidence about in fact, what the areas where there's probably like a large amount of sort of overlap between the Twitter and and the survey data, for example. Could we learn something from that? Right? If we could actually find those small little nuggets of information there, then we could make better ties between physical reality and sort of basically cyberspace. But it's an open problem. I might be a bit going out into like space there, but I think you get it. Any other questions? Yeah, go Ruth.
No, that's really interesting. It's a topic that I'm like particularly interested in. And I suppose this is like more, it's not about directly what you've done, but maybe what you could do. Could you think about how anti-vax like narratives are like spread on the network, if you know what I mean, and how that like has parallels in the real world? Because I suppose the thing with the anti-vax content is a lot of people are producing it and sharing it, and it's people then receiving that and then that informs their opinions. So I don't know if it was something you thought about or something you were able to do with this data. I think it's a different sort of project.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely, there's been work in that area. It's quite a lot of work looking at sort of the diffusion across networks. And I think Ian basically commented on this early on, which you said, when he basically said that there's so much misinformation inside there. And from it's not just the misinformation from like few sources. There's all these different layers and levels of misinformation that it's really hard. There's bots, there are people, and then there are people that just don't care. And this sort of personal information, like a mom, for example, if I'm on WhatsApp, anything with church or whatever comes to my phone. You know, how do you I mean, she's not like, thank God she's not on Twitter. But right, but it's there's a lot of levels inside it, and there's really good work inside it, but yeah, Matt JSON stuff, just like Twitter is just such a hard nut to crack. There's a lot of assumptions about this basically being representative of reality, and I think there's more as you think it's a really good starting point, but it shouldn't. I don't think it's a definite answer. It should be used as more augmentation to additional sort of layers. Oh, thank you.
Your question.
Okay.
I've got one for you. Your regression model.
Yeah.
Which was done with the survey data, right?
Yeah.
Do you find any of the explanatory variables being particularly dominant?
Yeah, so we haven't gotten to that yet. So we've seen some stuff, but at the moment, what we're doing is just looking at this sort of covariate values and then trying to match it with the literature. So we're sort of in that process, but we haven't spent a lot of time inside it. So we're in that place right now. But you're right, there's some of the stuff that we saw there with political affiliations, blue states versus red states, for example. You know, we see obvious, you know, like higher contribution from, you know, larger vaccine hesitancy groups in areas where there's red states, you know, things like age, for example, and these things, you know, part of us sort of discovering what are the various factors that lead people to become vaccine hesitant. I mean, this was linked to the literature, but now we're basically trying to go back. We've gotten like a big group of things, like 50 indicators. We got it down to like about 20 or so, and now we're going back to actually see not just the individual types of literature, but combinations. So that's where we are right now in terms of not looking at individual covariate values, but time the collection of how they all fit together to actually tell a story about it.
So combinations.
Yeah. So we're like right there right now. So I just don't know more than that right now.
That would be one of the most interesting parts if you can.
Yeah.
Then you can start explaining your.
Yeah. So really interesting.
Do you think vaccine hesitancy when it's reached % vary with like the time when vaccines are released?
Yeah, so it's funny, you know, we've been looking at stuff, myself and I've been looking at some of this stuff too. And we're definitely looking at evolutionary sort of topic of time in respect to vaccines, and we do see that. And that's obvious, right? In terms of like, as soon as vaccines come out, this seems to be like a wave coming up saying that, it's like, hey, don't do it, don't you dare do it, don't do it. But I think, there's that, but what's really interesting, I find in that is not those people like in virtual space where they have virtual placards basically saying no vaccines or whatever is basically, I think the research is basically what leads up to that. Yeah, I guess there's all these different triggers that we're missing it in the data, and you don't get it in the cyberspace. It's just too much assumption. But physical space, the data is difficult to get, and that's a problem. So.
Okay, then, so let's thank Ruth again. Now we move on to conference.
Yeah.
Until 11.
That's something it's like that. Like it's also like people would be like watching.
You were all fun things already. They tried to look at I guess.
Good morning. So we've got a potential schedule. Our first speaker for this session will be about patterns of internal migration during COVID in Spain.
The do button, I don't get it.
It's kind of like a 5-4, yeah, when it wants to.
Right. Hi everyone, my name is Niall. I'm a PhD student here in the lab. My research interests are based around population change, particularly population decline. And today I'll be presenting paper that I was very happy to be involved in with friends from the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona. The talk is very similar to Francisco in Commons. We look at patterns of internal migration during COVID, mainly in Spain. So to start, a little bit of background on population change in Spain. So from 2000 to 2020, the population of Spain grew by nearly 17%. However, the majority of the areas were actually experiencing population decline. So 62% were actually in decline. Population decline is most prominent in rural areas. So 70.9% of rural areas experience a decline. It's also prevalent in cities and to a lesser extent suburbs and towns. Population growth then is concentrated in the big urban areas of Spain and also in coastal regions. So COVID-19 disruption, Spain was particularly affected by COVID, especially in the early sort of periods, mainly in 2020, with large cities particularly affected. These would be sort of epicenters of infection,
mainly owing to high population density, strong air connectivity, and sort of public facing job roles. And we all know this is the disruptions we sort of lived through. We won't go through that too much. So there was COVID-19 disruption related to demographic trends. So for fertility, we see a fairly consistent reduction in the number of births throughout the end of 2020 COVID effect here, resulting in decreased fertility rates. And with regard to mortality, as you can imagine, we observed increased mortality owing to COVID. In total, we observed 72,000 excess deaths in Spain. Regarding international migration, as we all know, borders were closed and things like this, so international migration increased across both provinces, particularly migration to urban areas. So aims of this study then is to examine the changes in internal migration in Spain during 2020. And we have 4 sort of questions we would like to answer. The first looks at the trends of migration across Spain. How do they compare to pre-COVID times? The second looks at the sort of flows across the Spanish urban hierarchy. So we distinguish between core cities, suburban areas, towns, and rural areas. Good question. We would like to know how these patterns change over the course of the pandemic. And finally, a bonus one that I've added in is how do these trends in internal migration relate to population decline trends across Spain. So the data we use, we take registered microdata. I understand that the people from SED have like exclusive access to this sort of data, so not something that can be accessed by everyone. This data reports all changes in residential addresses in Spain between January 2016 and December 2020, and it contains origin, destination, and it's also timestamp, so we know at which point in the year this movement was recorded. With regards to the methods, we really didn't do anything that complex. So we classify areas mainly based on population size, and we calculate the rate of net migration, and we basically perform a descriptive analysis of these spatial and temporal trends. So really very easy to follow. So for some results, there are quite a lot of graphs, so I'll try and explain what's actually happening. So this top left graph, we see different trends of internal migration comparing for the pre-COVID period, so 2019 to 2020. Really, in the times we see this sort of spatial equilibrium. So there's not so much population redistribution occurring within Spain. Main trends that we see is suburbs gaining population, and core cities and rural areas recording a net loss. However, during COVID, we see some dramatic differences in these trends. So we see a big acceleration of net losses in core cities, represented here. And we can see that there's a reversal of this trend in rural areas. The rural areas have gone from net losers to net gainers in population during COVID. This graph at the bottom shows internal migration trends for each of the 5 main urban areas and where these migrants are going. So pre-COVID, we see again suburbanization represented here in this first column, and there are differences between regions, right? However, during COVID, we see increases in all destination migrants from cities, as represented by this darker column. Is greater than in pre-COVID times, and the changes reflect processes of counter-urbanization for people moving from cities to rural areas, which results in significant population growth in rural areas in 2020. These graphs basically show like the same sort of thing. They're perhaps a little bit nicer. So again, we see pre-COVID patterns of suburbanization represented by the reds here, and then during COVID we see counter-urbanization. So these rural areas formerly centers of migration receiving migrants during COVID. And then finally, we look at the temporal trends. We can see that there are deviations from the pre-COVID baseline throughout the period, so from March start of COVID to the end of the year. However, we see a convergence in pre-pandemic levels towards the end of 2020. So we can conclude that the trends are temporary. So for our discussion, we frame our results in this way. We consider during COVID there was a reduced attachment to big cities. As we know, as I mentioned at the beginning, cities were particularly impacted by COVID. People were confined to small living places, which were not very good at sort of accommodating remote work and homeschooling, and business closures and social distancing really stripped away the vibrancy of these urban spaces. When we combine this with the rise of teleworking, which sort of reduces the need for work-related considerations with regards to deciding where you want to live, resulting sort of preferences for houses in more remote sort of areas. So to conclude, then we see this reverse to look at migration and population trends during COVID, although these patterns do appear to be temporary. However, this is not something that's really included in the paper, but something I wanted to talk about. There does seem to be some sort of potential for sort of future rural population growth when we consider these sort of work patterns that are. I don't want to say statistics because we are back into offices. However, there are some sort of funding factors that are driving organisations to sort of continue this working from home trend. And in Spain, 61% of people surveying wanted to continue teleworking beyond COVID. When we consider as well that recently Spain spent 500 million euros in developing broadband infrastructure in rural areas, there does seem to be some sort of genuine potential for this. What was the word? Oh, sorry. This reduced attachment to big cities may sort of continue to be on COVID, which could signal some population growth in rural areas that will typically lose in population before COVID times. We'll see. I think.
Will the next stage of the analysis be like, why did we see the result?
This, I should have mentioned at the beginning, this work is already published. So it is a complete study. As far as I'm aware, I don't think we're planning on doing anything else with this, although it would be interesting, right? This is very sort of like surface level analysis, so we didn't really do anything special. And yeah, there are some sort of questions that are left unanswered, but I don't think we're doing anything.
Have you looked at the trends due to COVID in other countries, and is it similar to what you found in Spain?
I've not, no, no, we didn't in this paper either. I think this was more just because we had this exclusive access to the data, so it was interesting to sort of confirm whether these sort of urban exodus trends were actually real or not. But no, we haven't really sort of compensated.
The permanence of the patterns is quite interesting. Because obviously there's, with the way in which it guides policy, investments in broadband and those types of things, that's on the expectation that those patterns will remain. Have you done anything on that?
No, I'm not. And like I said, I've added this sort of in some sort of differentiate between accounts for. But I am interested in this. I do think that there is such an
The bounce back almost.
Yeah. I'm a bit busy, but I would like to, I have some plans that I would like to sort of maybe when I get a chance. And especially now, as time sort of goes on, we have access to, you know, the greater data. So, yeah, maybe something for the future.
It's interesting that you mentioned this because Spain has a problem of, and they call it the bleeding of rural areas.
Yeah.
Like there's no one in the villages. I find it surprising. I didn't know about it.
Yeah.
That they've invested so much in improving those regions.
Yeah, they are particularly left behind. I think this was from the EU as well. But yeah, I guess we'll see in the future if there's actually going to make any, yeah, especially remote rural regions in Spain, so those away from, you know, cities, they are particularly disadvantaged.
So with the movement from the cities, to the rural areas, who's covered in the data? Is that all the population? I know you said it's not open access, and does it include people that are moving from rental properties, or is it just purchasing properties, or?
It's registered data, so it's people who have registered a change in address. There were issues with the data when you consider that during COVID, these registration centers were closed. So most of the registration data that we have comes from online registration provider, which is used to buy. So yeah, it doesn't really consider these sort of like like informal moves, I guess you could call them. And another thing, in Spain, there is a high prevalence of second residency, so people live in cities for like a second vacation home. And again, if you were to own this place, right, and you moved during COVID, no sort of registration would be involved. So if anything, our data sort of underestimates the sort of effects that will happen during COVID. Yeah, maybe like a hybrid in terms of, you know, using these modern forms of data, and then we could be more representative of what's actually happening.
Okay, we're going to take again. Our next speaker is
Now, but yeah.
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 Thanks everyone. I'm Gladys. I'm going to be presenting a project I did for my master's dissertation. So it's titled The Value of Urban Amenities in House Prices during COVID-19. So I was interested if there was a change to the value of amenities because we weren't using them. And yeah, so I'm going to cover a bit of background results and discussion. It's kind of done a first draft of it for the dissertation. And so there's going to be more improvements on it. So the main research questions I answered were what happened to house prices and supply during the pandemic, and did the value of parks, metros and shops within the 10-minute walk of the property change during the pandemic. So we haven't really had data to explore the impact of the pandemic on the housing market. And yeah, so the ideas of data that I used allowed us to look at very fine grained changes for the housing market during the pandemic, and also we're able to measure the implicit value of having access to these and then look through time and see if the value changes. Madrid is the capital of Spain, political and economic capital. It's the 6th largest city in Europe by population, so it's pretty big. It has 3.2 million residents. A large proportion of immigrants and also aging population. And it's also heavily reliant on tourism, service industry, services and cheap and things. And it's the major financial center as well. So when we're thinking about the effects of COVID and like the closure of non-essential businesses and the kind of economic effects, it's an interesting case to look at. Spain was also one of the worst affected countries in terms of GDP during the pandemic. So the IMF report that the GDP in Spain got by about 10%. And it was also, as it's the most built up area and most populated area of Spain, it was naturally best for these maps, this one shows house prices. So the lighter colours are the cheaper properties and the dark colours are more expensive. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see this kind of monocentric structure where we have cheaper properties on the outside and more expensive properties in the middle. This is like a historic urban core in the middle of Madrid, and it attracts lots of tourists and house prices here. And we can also see that there's a little bit of a change in the pattern where there's more expensive properties to the north of the city. And this is what this map shows as well. So this shows the location and size of single family properties. The single family properties are where there's just one residence within one building, so like a detached house. The multi-family properties would be like a flat or a semi-detached house. So these are the largest and most expensive properties, and we can see that there's this kind of band at the top where a lot of these really big, expensive and detached houses are located. This is one of the most affluent parts of Madrid, and kind of the southeast and near the city centre and that's just a bit of background. The data used as presented from Idealista, which is like an online property advertising company. And so we have listing data for 2020 and 2021, and for some legal reasons they have to be aggregated within the H3 grid. So they are at individual level, but they've been aggregated into 21,000 hexagons with an average size of about 2,000 square meters. So in total there was 55,000 properties in the data set. And then to look at accessibility, I collected points of interest from the street map and your Python library. Yeah, and then aggregated these to the H2 bridge. Yeah, so these are the tags that are used for the amenities. So you can see subway, park, and the red dots are retail centres. There is a lot of different ways that you can like tag these features. So I tried a couple and what I ended up using. So the spatial feature engineering, which is what I did to have a measure of access for each of the hexagons. So I collected the location of the amenities, and then drew a 500-meter buffer around each of the hexagons, which is like about 10-15-minute walk. And counted the number of parks, metro stations, and retail shops within that buffer, and then I was able to have a number for each of the hexagons. So some results. This is the average house price during 2020 and 2021. On the left, we have single family properties, and on the right is multi-family properties. So they show kind of a fairly similar trend, just with the kind of sharp increase at the end. And this is during the lockdown period, and there was a kind of decline, particularly here for multi-family properties. I think it would be interesting, this kind of needs to contextualize, because it would be interesting to look at the trends on previous years to kind of understand whether this effect is not the case. We can also look at the supply of housing, which is a unique aspect of the data. And we know like how many properties that are presented in the site are not property occupied. So we kind of see a really sharp drop, particularly multi-family properties. I mean, there was much more on average multi-family, which is advertised. But we should see this really steep climb from 4,000 properties a month to 500. And this trend kind of goes on towards the end of the pandemic year. So the main analysis after I've done the feature engineering was to fit these in a OLS hedonic model. So I was looking at how they contribute to house price and whether this changed through time. So I fit the model for each month that I had and plotted the coefficient. And you can see that there's not really a change or a kind of obvious change in the value of the community. But the metro stations are positively associated with house prices, and retail units on top like a slight negative correlation. But I think this is like a preliminary finding, but I think if the method was improved, nothing might find it. So yeah, the type of modeling strategy, I'm using an ordinary spread model. There's a lot of spatial correlation in with house prices and the exponential factors. So spatial lag model probably more. Yeah. Also, there's a lot of missing variables when we're trying to estimate house prices. There's a lot of different factors that affect house prices and a lot of people. Also, kind of with the access measure, there was a lot of hexagons that had zero, so zero shops and parks or metros in the nearby vicinity, which may have affected the model. And it would also be good to kind of know if there isn't one in the immediate vicinity, how far away. So yeah, that could be improved, and also yeah, the cumulative opportunity approach. So I counted the physical number of these amenities within a short walking distance, and there was no kind of decline in their weighting as they got further away, which a lot of accessibility studies suggest you need to have like a repeated function to measure that. Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Gladys, I'm interested in one of the figures that you presented was the house prices over time, the single,
Yeah,
it was really, this one here on the left. Seemed really volatile.
yeah.
I was wondering if you knew if this was like a normal thing.
My guess is
Maybe
that
you could have wanted it like, you know, like how we did in the paper, right? Presented, we had like a baseline, an average of like the years before.
yeah.
You could see if it was unusual. I don't know much about house pricing. Really.
Okay, there's a lot of fluctuation, but I think it's probably because there isn't many observations. Yeah, so there's a lot more, I can't remember off the top of my head, but like there's way more multi-family properties. And yeah, like a lot of them, like they're all shown in this figure.
Okay.
And this is all of the hexagon. So yeah, I guess. So I think this is really interesting. And like this was actually the aim of like, I was interested in the value of communities and whether they change. But I think the fact that we can actually look at the initial effect of pandemic on the supply and price of housing.
You might be able to smooth away a bit of that with like a kind of moving average.
Okay.
So you might get a little bit less volatility if we potentially visualize the pattern a little bit more smoothly, maybe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
you just pull in a bit more
that's
data then, yes. Good ranges.
Thank you. I would also be interested to look at rents as well. There's like loads of things, and also structural, and we would avoid doing the whole accessibility thing if I looked at like structural features of the house and whether the value of things change.
So your conclusion was that the economics and microeconomics is going to affect comparison.
They didn't know, but I was kind of quite interested in whether there was any change. And also there's probably spatial variation in like the geographic weighted regression model might be interesting to see. But in certain areas, if there's a really large, really nice park nearby, it may have way more of an impact on the price. So yeah, kind of spatial variation in this.
I have one very minor. When you were taking in the kind of contextual, were you using H3 geometry or was it just?
Yeah.
Because there's what I was going to say about the buffers for H3.
Yeah.
Built into H3, there's some really nice. There's some really nice functions where you can do very quick sort of buffer analysis. So I'll show you how that works at some point. But it may be quite a lot speedier, I suspect.
Yeah, and I did just use kind of an arbitrary like 500 meters, like walking up there, and we probably.
Kind of, Alex has kind of asked the question that I was going to ask.
You love
I do this
H3.
stuff when I love H3. So yeah, it's kind of all to do with that sort of thing. So I was kind of thinking are you counting are you counting the number of parks within a hexagon? Is that what you're doing? Like, are you saying is a park within or not within? I'm wondering if it makes more sense to count the distance to the nearest park rather than
zero.
Exactly. The other thing as well, Gladys, is I don't know what size hexagons you're using, but you might want to go up a bit more because the idea is about kind of like the neighborhood of these houses, right? And if you're using too low of a scale, you're talking about micro neighborhoods rather than the actual neighborhood. So
one property.
yeah. Okay, so it probably makes more sense to. I think if you had something like sort of like a hexagon that captures a 5 or 10 minute walk from any point to the boundary, that would be a much better accurate representation of features. But I think it's good. We've got some code on getting better tags out of OpenStreetMap. So I can give you that code for because I did have a lot of problems with getting retail data out of OpenStreetMap. So
There's so many ways to find
there is, yeah.
And even like when I looked at this, some of the parks seemed kind of odd shapes and like I don't know. Especially the parts that are not points, you know, the polygons. So. Thank you.
If I may say a couple of things in Spanish.
Yeah.
One thing is that during the lockdowns in Spain, people were not really allowed to go in the streets, so I'm not sure if having access to a car would make that. And the other thing is that parks in Spain are not as nice as they are in England. So
I also wouldn't be surprised if you find a negative correlation with the distance of the park and the park. Yeah, I guess what I was kind of wondering is like you say, like people that you weren't allowed to go outside, did the value of these things that you would kind of expect that they would probably decrease. But which is assuming that there is a value to them. But that's what I was kind of interested if there was any change to that. But I think maybe I wasn't quite measuring that as well. So maybe like some kind of mobility data or something might be useful as well.
Okay. And our next speaker is Eunsun. The last day, so tired. But I use my kids.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Okay, thank you. My second part is a proposal for Korea. Korea and UK cooperative research. Focus on educational data-driven analysis for privacy. But I want to only my idea, but people talking about this one, I want to some show the few things because I didn't have the time to save my speech. I have no time. I couldn't show this one. So you understand all of the concept of IMD. So just I'm going to skip them and talk about the structure. So Korea IMD composed of 3 levels. As a first level is MBI. Is about which vision is relatively deprived in which domains. Is this is a city level, and second level is which facilities is deprived in terms of supply and demand, and the last level 3 is index is for simulation about the effectiveness of the newly proposed facilities in the open. So this is there is something we want to emphasize in this study. We make the composite unit, but overall small index may mask enough information to understand the inner circumstance or sectoral deprivation of the cities. So this is the result of the composite index of the but for example, even if the overall score is equal second class, which city may be more deprived of medical care, and the other city may be more vulnerable to crime area. So we have the some symbol box, use the symbol box. So especially we are level 2 LDI is a is living environment deprivation index. We say LDI is measured in 2 sides. One is supply side quantity of facilities, and the other is accessibility to facilities. Score F is the amount of facility supply, the number of facilities for 1,000 people, and
squad A used the ratio of the service population considering accessibility. The two variables were standard and synthesized. In this process, the same score was applied without weighting. So we, after calculating all percentages in the same way, it was aggregated into about 3,000 special units. We say Eunsun is a lower municipal units at nationwide. So we make the classified into 10 levels. Readiness is more difficult, and blue color is more least difficult. So so this map is a final comprehensive score LDI. It measures the 5 types facility: health, growth, education, safety, facility, work, and last one, culture. It was found that cities more deprived than rural areas. Also, we need to check the detailed sub-score, so we make it in an interactive report. So I will show. I will. This is our homepage provide the interactive report field, but we make the Korean language. You need to study Korean. Understand well. Maybe Dr. Zhang and so we may translate.
Yeah, we're gonna translate this year.
Really?
Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe Catherine can read the. But you want to where is first one we here is the select the stone to schedule. We to the schedule. Schedule is one so red color is the more difficult and blue color is the so we can you know anything anywhere you can click the
Inside of.
yeah. Okay. We have two diagrams. The upper is the supply side, and the lower is the demand side. Accessibility service area has the ratio of the population. So we want to the five factor so different to the differentiation problem. So okay, thank you.
Okay, can you explain?
So, education, thank you. Okay, Okay, like the UK, IMD by CDRC, it's very nice with interactive dashboard. So Korea guys has to also create interactive report visualization is but we are trial version. So UK is the official version, I think. But we are only developing the living infrastructure, living facility is can collect the data is a micro level. So another side is example financial or income, other data is we need to more try to collect the micro level. So okay. This one is we trying to some simulation index for the effectiveness of the newly proposed facility location. But in the 100 grid units, so now keep it one. I have no time. So this is my idea. Just preparing I'm this workshop. What we can research together. So I think the development of GeoPIAT is a geospatial driven policy impact assessment tool. It's a tentative item. And its background is when a complex crisis occurs, where are the vulnerable places? There is no reliable data for policymakers who are thinking about where to allocate resources. How can policy signalize be used if a complex crisis occurs in the near future? So this research idea, the objective is to develop a GeoPIAT that can monitor community vulnerability to coping complex crises. And so also to apply GeoPIAT for coping complex crises by practice and communities. I quickly designed the process of this project. And first we collect and investigate our complex crisis occurrence and impact cases. And we need to define a vulnerability index in terms of complex crisis response. And the major variables of vulnerabilities is due to spatial and temporal micro grid level, because we have to many big data when we use the AI, machine learning, So we developed the estimation model for complex crisis vulnerability, and next we need to develop a scenario to respond to complex crisis by multi-scale. And last, we developed a scenario-based PRT. I think the impact assessment indicators is example. Efficiency was stability, was safety, inclusive, and comfort. So that I'm simply idea, but we need to the Korean situation has this kind of model. The last slide. I think you showed me the amazing geodemographics of Alex and his students, and Danny's urban grammar and Mark's ground well. It's very interesting and exciting and amazing study. I think your research team will have to study Korea's new smart teaching model in the era of complex crisis. And this diagram is very simple idea, but I will continue to develop it to national monitoring framework. If you have any good idea or question, please send to email. Now. Okay, thank you. Any questions for?
I have one very quick question, but we'll email them otherwise. Was there any data that you'd like to have included in the model which you didn't have access to? So are there things that you would like to measure?
IND?
Yeah,
Korean IND?
yeah. So is there things that you would like to have in that you haven't got any data for?
This one?
Yeah, so lots of data goes
Yeah,
into it.
yeah.
Is there anything that you would like to have measured, but you don't have the data?
I will have to my colleague. I'm going to read it.
You can't.
Yeah, all data is from the public sector, so we really want to the credit card data or some cell phone data or those kind of data sets, but it's
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Sometimes the swimming pool like that is there is a two, one is a public swimming pool, one is a private swimming pool. Yeah, but we only have the public swimming pool. Yeah, so that's the kind of issue. Yeah, so and sometimes the parking lot or parking space, there are a lot of private companies, they have lots and the buildings, but we don't have that information. So that's the kind of issues.
Maybe we need CDRT
Yeah.
Korea.
I'm our last speaker for the morning, Patrick.
And she got the
Thank you, man.
bad top job.
Yeah, like a car, she did something like that.
Yeah.
Sing along. That's a pretty good idea.
Okay, right, so I have the horrible job of trying to close this stuff out. I'm gonna just, because I know what's coming, I'm gonna just move this a little bit. Otherwise you're not gonna be able to see anything. There's lots of memes in this, and I want it to be clear that you can see the memes, because that's what I'm here for. So this paper, as you've kind of heard me hint and moan about all week, is an absolute car crash. But it's kind of relevant, so hopefully there'll be something interesting in it. So basically the idea, and I'll tell you a little bit about my PhD in a minute and how this all fits, but the idea was basically, let's get some really cool mobility data, let's join it with some retail centre definitions and then use them to do some sort of spatio-temporal analysis of how retail centres have recovered as we emerge out of the pandemic. If we are emerging out of the pandemic, I don't know if we're ever going to be formally out of the pandemic. So this is a paper with Alex and Les, and it works in partnership with my PhD partner called Geolytics, who many of you probably know. But you guys, they're a company that do like location analysis of big retailers, and they have lots of data. And this data I'm going to talk about is their kind of state of the art data set. But as you're going to see, it's not as state of the art. So we tell you it. So I think it's not back there. So right, let's see how we're doing. Okay, so this was the original title of the paper, and anyone who was at Newcastle RGS, that's what you saw me present. Then we went for a review, and now we've had to go, okay, it's not right, we need to change tack a bit here. So it's now being called more to be done-ish. So basically, this is kind of the data, I'm going to say a little bit about in a minute, but the idea is that the paper is a bit of a nightmare, but we're not giving up, we are going to get something out of it. So
It's all about retail centres and mobility data in short. So, retail centre geographies, that's what my PhD has been about, really, is about retail centre geographies, like all these different things. So we did this paper that's out now, it's in Annals, and it's all about kind of bringing together like a holistic view of retail centre geographies by talking about lots of different things. So the first thing we talk about a lot in my PhD is understanding where retail centres are located. So that involves bringing lots of data about retailers, where they're located in space, what the building footprints are like, what other data can we supplement to derive kind of these boundaries of retail centres. We did that for the whole of the US, and that was one of the kind of key objectives of that paper. Then we've got this idea of the what, which is kind of like what characteristics do these places have? So how can we use machine learning techniques and classification techniques to build up these kind of typologies or classifications of different retail centres? And then the final element is about who uses these places. And that's where we talk about kind of retail centre catchments and all that kind of thing. And this framework was all about kind of bringing these three things together, kind of thinking about them, conceptualizing the interactions between these different things. But then more importantly, showing how these interactions relate to external phenomena. So one of the things that we talked a lot about in the PhD is about COVID. Obviously, I did the PhD in the pandemic. So COVID has been a big thing. So that's kind of what the idea of this last paper of my PhD was about, was how can we use kind of some of these things, so definitions, the classifications and the catchments, to do some analysis about how retail centres have responded in the pandemic. And that's what this kind of framework is all about. So I don't really need to tell you, because if you saw Natalie's talk yesterday, you'll know fully well that retail has changed in the pandemic. Everything's changed. We've got all these new behaviours. We've got this idea of non-essential versus essential retailing. We had stockpiling of toilet paper in the UK for some reason. It's so strange. I think I bought a lot more flat whites in the pandemic than I used to. So that's one thing that I used to do. So yeah, it's changed a lot. Shopping has really changed. And lots of analysis is talking about how, like, you know, Walmart has got loads more money, or coffee shops are new, or, you know, the leisure industry was affected or whatever. But there's not a lot about retail centres and high streets. So these are two examples. This is a bit of a shameless plug again. Sorry. That's from my first paper, my PhD, and we basically were just like, okay, let's do something really, really quick and look at how different types of retail centres in Chicago have responded to the pandemic, and that's what that paper is about. And this is a paper from colleagues at Loughborough, which is kind of not in Chicago, it's in the UK, obviously, because Chicago doesn't look as one in Garden City, because that's actually near where I'm from. And then basically what these two papers are sort of doing is saying, okay, let's look at the very quick onset of the pandemic. What does it do to retail centres and high streets across the UK? And that's kind of been worn out now a little bit. That kind of narrative is kind of known. We know what the impact of the early lockdown really was on COVID. It's now sort of moving towards kind of the longer term impacts, or some of the more kind of recent things. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with this paper. So how do we measure like changes in activity in retail centres? Well, like, there's lots of different ways. One way you could do it is you could look at sales data in a retail centre, but for anyone who's done anything to do with cities or agglomerations, you know that getting sales data is impossible, because you're talking about decentralized retailers in the system. So you can't be like, right, Costa, give me your sales figures, H&M, give me your sales figures, and then aggregate that. It doesn't work like that. That's not the system that we live in this country. So one way that we do is we use footfall data. So you get a footfall sensor that looks a bit like this, and the footfall sensor can tell you a little bit about what activity is being detected in a retail centre over time. And this is a paper by a colleague, Susie, who also did a PhD here at Liverpool, about how we can use footfall data to basically build up these kind of hierarchies and about retail centres in the UK. But what Susie's paper really gets at is that geographical coverage is not good. So footfall sensors generally privilege highly urbanised areas, the major cities of the UK. London particularly has a huge dominance of these footfall sensors. So when you're trying to do something at the national level to understand how everywhere is being affected by the pandemic, sensors like this are not particularly useful in that case. So that's one way that you could do it. Another way that Les is very fond of is vacancy rates. You could look at changes in the way vacancy rates are being calculated across centres. So you could say, we've got more vacant units in the pandemic, less vacant units, where is these differences emerging? Is it in certain regions, in certain types of high streets? But again, anyone who's worked with retail data knows that this kind of measure, or this way of measuring performance, is quite static, because it depends on how quickly you can get vacancy data on these places, which generally you can't get any less than annually really, because it's basically just what the data that the people are collecting. So this is where my brilliant idea came in to use mobility data, which turned out to be not such a brilliant idea, but we're going to roll with it anyway. So this is the data from geolytics. They call it their geolytics in-app aggregated location mobility data set. It's a mouthful. But basically what it looks like is something like this. You have the individual hexagons across geographic space. You have mobility. You have mobility measured in two ways. You have the number of devices that are detected within each of these cells. So that's the phone in a cell at a specific time point. But then you also have this other thing called events, or some of you might know it as impressions, which is like when you open up your phone and you open up Google Maps, that's an impression. Then you open up Facebook, that's an impression. Then you open another app, that's an impression. And it starts to count these things. So you've got these two measures of mobility that you can use in space to do things with. So we ended up using the two together. We count impressions and devices over time and use that as our kind of measure of mobility within these centers. So if you imagine this would be like Leeds city centre, we take all the data within this polygon and aggregate it and count basic mobility over time. That's kind of the principle, the way we did it. So back to retail centres, for those of you who are familiar with the CDRC and stuff, this is bread and butter stuff, but basically we have retail centre definitions and indicators across the UK. It's about 6,000 polygons that tell you about where all the major retail centres are across the UK. We're focusing on about 1,000 of these, so those kind of in the typically most urbanised areas where disclosure control is going to be a massive problem. I suppose we could extend that further if we wanted to. And then part of the analysis, we didn't want to just look at the whole trends across all retail centres. We wanted to look at retail centres with certain characteristics. So one way we could do it was, you can't really see it that clearly on this thing, but you've got these different types of retail centres, and that's kind of what we would call a hierarchy. So you can look at how different types of retail centres have responded, so how has your city centre responded as opposed to your local retail park. But you could also do something with these structural indicators, which I developed last year, where you could say, okay, how has a more deprived retail centre responded in comparison to one that's less deprived? Or what about somewhere that's got a high proportion of vacant units, for instance, as opposed to somewhere that doesn't? That's kind of the idea. We wanted to see how different types of centres responded to the pandemic, but also centres with different structural characteristics as well. So the research questions then really, first thing is about mobility data. Is it a good proxy measure for economic performance? Can we use mobility data as a substitute for footfall, for sales figures and vacancy rates? Can we use them to look at more recent periods of the pandemic? Because as I sort of showed you, there's kind of literature about the early phases, the major lockdowns that it's saturated now. We kind of know what's going on. We don't really, not that interested in this. We're more interested about recovery, about long-term strategy, how these places are starting to become more popular again, as we kind of go back to normal life, or new normal, if that's what you can use. And then finally, as I sort of hinted at in that last slide, how are these responses determined by function? So function being what type of centre you're talking about here, top of the hierarchy to the bottom, or structure, so what is its characteristics, for instance. They're the three kind of main research questions. So, some findings then. This is basically a figure that shows COVID cases over time. So the time of study that I'm looking at is August 2021 to August 2022. So this is a very different period to a lot of the stuff we've seen thus far in this seminar series, because we're talking about a period that was basically just Omicron. We're not talking about Delta, we're not talking about Alpha or wild type. We're talking about Omicron, because that's the data period that we have data geolytics from. They only started collecting their data or making it available to us from August of last year, which is kind of annoying. It'd be good to see some of these responses on a bit more of a longer time scale, but we can't, which is annoying. So then what we do is we take our mobility measure, which is basically just the number of impressions per device in a retail centre, and look at these trends over time. And what we're starting to see is obviously some really quite obvious trends. I'll explain this red line in a second, but if we look, we're seeing kind of uplifts and downlifts and things. We've got a major subvariant here. This is when infections went absolutely crazy last Christmas. But we're still seeing an uplift in activity around this, and that's due to Christmas. Generally, people are still going to carry on shopping over Christmas because at this period of time, Boris said, you don't need to stay at home. You can if you want, but you don't need to. So people were like, well, obviously, I'm just going to go to John Lewis and buy Toblerone or whatever people do at Christmas. I'm not saying I'm screwed or whatever, but so yeah, so that's the thing. So we're starting to see these kind of general patterns of slight increases in recovery and that kind of thing. But we've got this mysterious red dotted line here, which is basically what I'm positing as a kind of uncertain period, and that's due to the underlying problems with this mobility data. So here we have impressions or events over time. It doesn't stay consistent. So basically what you're seeing is no matter what way you use that measure in your data, you're always going to see the slope that goes like this, because you're not getting the same number of people or the same number of devices and events in your sample. So you can't actually work out what the kind of significant kind of stability of that data is over time, which is a massive problem with mobility data. The problem is because we don't get the raw data from geolytics, you can't get out a fixed number of users or a fixed number of devices and then just track them over time. You're getting this aggregated data product, which has a good spatial coverage, but not a particularly good temporal stability. So it causes problems when you've got something like this, where you're trying to look at trends over time, but the underlying metadata is causing lots of problems. And this has created a lot of problems for me, because probably what I should have done, given that I need to finish my PhD in about 2 weeks' time, is not admitted this and just published this paper and got away with it. But I did, and then the reviewers hammered me for it. So now we're in a problem where we have fessed up to the problems with this data, and we don't know what to do. So you're going to see in the next slide, basically, oh yeah, so I got rickrolled by the data, basically. They just rickrolled me, and now I have, yeah, the reviewers rickrolled me and the data's rickrolled me, so that's fine. So Rick's going to stay with us for a bit, apparently. So this is kind of what we were trying to do. We're trying to look at some of these trends over time. How have these different types of sensors responded around this period? And then how have these trends manifested between different regions, for instance? Would you see these different kind of variations? But obviously, as you guys are probably thinking in your heads right now, all these findings are kind of meaningless. They're not really telling us anything because the underlying metadata is wrong, is broken, it doesn't work. So where next? Where do we go with this research? So I thought I'd take a bit of an unconventional approach and actually show you some of my comments of my reviewers, because I think that's funny and everyone can laugh at me. So one of the things that happened, and I'm really pleased Francisco, Mark, and Danny aren't in the room right now, because they would be like, ha ha ha, I told you so. Basically, one of the big problems was, Patrick, you need to do a regression model because it's not good enough to just look at trends on graphs. And I was like, yeah, I agree. And we had this conversation about a year ago when we started this paper, but we also thought, can't be bothered. I'm not a statistician, I'm not a maths person, I'm a geographer. So I was like, I don't want to do that, but it seems like that's going to be what's going to happen. So if anyone wants to jump in on this project and help us do some modeling on what these trends are and how to deal with this data, I will happily put you down as the co-author because I need all the help I can get basically with this project. So that's the problem there. We've got to do some rigorous modeling of some of these trends. They're actually quite nice, the words I got from the reviewers, to be honest. This was a reviewer too as well, which is, unheard of. And then the other thing was basically what the other reviewers are saying is it's not good enough to say that these are the trends that we're seeing in Omicron because we have nothing to compare it to. Because we can't look at the pre-COVID trends, or we can't look at the trends during the height of the pandemic, we can't say for sure that what we're seeing is actually a result of Omicron. It's not something just to do with seasonality or holidays. So that's really, really tricky, and it's really hard to know what to do about that. And it's resulted in this sentence that says, unlikely to accurately conclude their findings, i.e. So yeah, so that's a bit of fun. So I've got to deal with this problem in my data too. So yeah, I should have put Rick back on that slide, really, shouldn't I? But so yeah, so that's the paper. It's been a bit of a nightmare, trust me. But if anyone has any questions or thoughts or suggestions, or just wants to kind of like pat me on the head and tell me that everything's going to be okay, that would be much appreciated as well. So thanks a lot, everyone.
It's not a question, but the review which I thought you were going to put on there, which I found was the most amusing, was the person who was a real believer that these were factual measures of what happened in retail centres, and he was a little bit outraged that you said that they might not be.
I suspect that person might be the other person who's currently trying to put geolytics paper through review at the moment, and has now realised that perhaps they're going to have the same problems when they go to the review. But I don't know. Yeah, we did get some funny reviews. I mean, a lot of it was very helpful. We put it into a journal called Urban Informatics, which is kind of new. It's kind of early conception, and the idea was it might be a bit easier to get it in, but it kind of backfired because we were completely transparent about everything that went wrong with this paper, which probably we shouldn't have done. But yeah,
When you mentioned about this slope and the uncertainty that you're getting, did you add that in your limitations for when you see?
Yeah, so basically, I have a section in the paper where I'm talking about the data, what it looks like, and that sort of thing. And I pretty much, the first thing you see in the paper is this slope. So it's like before I even started talking about the trends, I'm already admitting the things, basically. So probably again not a good thing. But I mean, we've been very clear and transparent about it. And I think, you know, a paper doesn't have to be like groundbreaking. Like what we've shown here is we need to think a bit more clearly about how we use mobility data, because there's lots of papers that use very similar data like this in like medical journals and things, and you don't ever see this being considered because they just assume it's ground truth, and it's not. So I think we fessed up and it backfired, but yeah, we'll just see what happens, I guess.
I was about to say how you could frame it, like the paper.
I think so. It's kind of probably going to go either that way, or not. I think it probably the problem I have here is this big logo at the bottom of this paper. Geolytics are my project partner, right? So I can't go to them, who I'm seeing tomorrow, by the way, they're going to ask me at Oxford what the hell's going on with this paper. I can't say to them, the data's a load of shit and you can't use it, because they're going to be like, well, why have we just funded your PhD for 4 years? Please tell us that our data products don't work. So it's really hard balance to know what to do. Because obviously it's a new data product, and I'm sure it's got lots of, like, Wendy and Mark wanted to use it for their groundwork project, but I kind of told them that it's not going to be a goer because they need more robust temporal coverage of this sort of thing. So it's probably going to turn into, well, what I'm definitely going to do, whatever happens, is write another paper, a self-reflection on what goes wrong in papers, because this is such a learning curve for me, because my other two were stressful, but this one has just been a nightmare, because we were supposed to have to spend, what, 6 weeks, wasn't it?
But you said that.
Yeah, and it's turned into like 6 months, and I've definitely got grey on the side of my hair, so. No. When you accept the postdoc, yeah.
Now, the question about the data is a lot easier. And you're talking about different sizes and different types of research unit. I wonder if you could, are you able with the data to look at how people are passing through or staying, or can you treat sensitively? Because with the retail centre, someone's going to be visiting there and visiting the retail centre.
Yeah.
A small town centre. Maybe passing through. I wonder if you
yeah, so you could do that. So kind of the examples I was sort of showing are kind of, they take a few retail centres as like a case study, and they look at the individual trends within that centre. But what the kind of overarching objective was to kind of provide a national overview of some of these things. And if you want to do a national overview, it's very difficult to find like a representative set of case studies focusing on a paper. I do agree, because basically all we're doing is we're aggregating to the retail centre level all of this high resolution data, and we're probably losing the granularity of like where exactly people are staying or how long they're staying for. The other thing that would be really good is kind of, as you hinted, would be really useful to have the individual information about people moving in and out of these cells and things, because then that way you could get out a stable sample of people to study, rather than just relying on whatever sample they come up with here. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but good question.
When I work at the consulting company, I usually retail centers and have kind of different classes. And sometimes some more very it's for high class model like that. But maybe the characteristic of the retail centers, and maybe the spending of the incomes of the who use that malls. I mean that might be some group of the people. I mean they don't kind of affected by the pandemic or something. So maybe that is how
that was an idea. So I can't get to it now, but one of the variables that we wanted to look at was if you take the catchment, the deprivation of the catchment, which is kind of across the ring, you might see differences. And what we kind of thought then is that you'd see like this is a period what we call kind of recommendations. It's not restriction. What we kind of thought would happen was in more deprived communities, people might be less willing to actually listen to the government and do whatever they wanted. Whereas people in more deprived communities or less deprived communities would actually be a bit more scared or a bit more, because
you know, all you have to do is go on Twitter around this period of time and you'd be like, the world is ending. Ah. So that was kind of an idea that we had, but it actually didn't work out so much to be much of an influence. Generally, what we're sort of been seeing is that the kind of type of centre controls more of the behaviour. So whether it's kind of in a city or whether it's an out of town retail shopping centre or a retail park, that generally controls it more. But again, as with anything I've kind of said in the last 12 minutes, you can kind of take it and just stop because it doesn't really have any value. So, good question.
Just a quick one about the data. I was just curious about the benefits of using the event data with those just devices.
Yeah, so this is a challenge. So the events data is basically like a subset of applications. It's not every single time someone uses an application on their phone. It's basically a subset of applications. And what at the RGS, I went to a session on this, and it was one of James Cheshire's PhD students was talking about everything wrong with this data in this session. And he was basically highlighting the subset of applications from which this data is derived. And it's an incredibly unrepresentative sample of the population. It's like prayer apps, menstrual cycle tracking apps, things like that. It's not like Google Maps or online retail. And then one of my reviewers was like, why didn't you just pull out the retail apps and just use that? And I'm like, good point. But again, it's just unrepresentative. So what we tried to do was, because you have like devices and the device might connect, say, 8 apps in a time window, whatever, was we tried to normalize it because devices and events are going like this. So we thought if we accounted for the changes in an event per device, it should flatten out a little bit more, and you still have that representative sample, but as you kind of seen, it's still very much going the way. So yeah, that was, I think events is probably more accurate because devices privileges kind of certain people and the subset sample, but whatever way we spin this measure, it doesn't seem to want to work or want to play ball, which is kind of infuriating. Hence why I have a therapy Pokemon toy at my desk.
Does it work?
Pardon?
Pokemon toy?
He just looks really lazy. It's a Snorlax. If anyone likes Pokemon, it's the really lazy one. Basically my personality. It just makes me want to go and lie down in bed and read a book. Do this.
I mean, like,
So that's therapy, right?
yeah. I mean, you know, the first person to encounter this, you just almost looks like a lessons learned, right? Just a lot of people. Has anyone used the data and published on it?
Not this one. So there's a data set that comes before this called from Park. I think Alex was talking about this earlier, data set. And they managed to publish data, well, published project. So James's PhD Terrier did a paper on lockdown and different things, but very much they got away with by basically just being able to say, just bear in mind that the temporal constraints of the data are there, they're present, they're in the way, but they didn't literally slap a graph right at the front that shows how bad it is. So they got away with it, and they published in actually quite a good journal. So, but their data is very similar to ours. And then someone was saying it would be good if you could harmonize the two so that you could actually bring them together, but that's another paper in itself, like harmonizing 2 different sources of mobility data and bringing them to something that can be for a long period of time. But this is what I mean, like there's a lot of papers using this kind of data, and they're just not talking about the problems with it, and it's causing chaos.
Like, for experiment, just make it into lessons learned and basically tie it into like the idea that data is important and we need to be more observant and inquire.
Yeah.
Make it so like a communication.
Exactly, I think so, and I'm going to present something on this next week at the Turing event, and I'm hoping, well, my thesis examiner is going to be in the room, before I actually stand up and defend it in front of them, but so yeah, so I'm hoping to just kind of reframe it. It'll either go like a completely different substantive contribution or something that's about problems of mobility data, and I think that's probably going to be the latter. The thing is though, as I said, Ron, is it's like how confident can you be of standing up and saying, well, everything I learned is that the data doesn't work when you've got a data partner who they're relying on that information. So it's a challenge, but it might be useful to them, who knows?
I want to just follow up on this because I was going to ask you previously, like what tracking apps they use to do and why the data looks like that, and what there is the incentive for people to use those specific apps, and is it seasonal? So you mentioned that it's prayers apps and peer tracking apps, which makes me think, yeah, they're probably seasonal because people will pray at specific times of year, maybe close to Christmas or whatever period in very it's relevant, and also specific days of the week. And then for the period starting after we had this discussion, like a lot of women who were using those apps before Roe in the US, this massively stopped because they were afraid my personal data will be tracked and then maybe I'll be in trouble by law. Like they have a miscarriage, maybe pregnant and abortion, things like that. They go for an abortion, get in trouble. So a lot of women were using those and stopped using. So you can interpret how the data changed over time if you find those.
Exactly. The problem is those niches are not available very easily. Like you don't have somewhere where you can like, here's Geolytics' metadata about the apps they use in their data products. You can't get that. If you could get that, it'd be really good. Because the other thing, not only do they have temporal changes spatially as well. So I think someone did an analysis of the religious apps, and they cluster in specific locations because people activate a prayer app when they go to mosque, when they go to church, right? So, or at home, not necessarily when they're in a retail store, they're doing their shopping. So it's like, how accurate is this actual spatial and temporal trend? Probably not very. You have to, so technically yes, but the events are generated every hour. So if you have that app open, still active on your phone, you know the way you have like active tabs on your phone, if that's still open in the next hour, then you get another impression from that device on that same app. So yeah, it's spatial temporal chaos is what I think. That's a great name for a case. Spatial temporal chaos. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone listening to me rant on about how my last favorite is Parker.
So Patrick was our last speaker with Ballantyne.
Yes, we've got lunch, but I think before we do lunch, we just want to do something quickly. We are going to run out of time at the end of the day. So I'd like to invite our visitors from Korea up to the front, please, because Alex and I would like to make a presentation. You all. So you just come up here. What you got? Okay, so probably explain the context.
The swapping of ceremony. Anyway, so Patrick and I, and as you know, is the case here as well, we wanted to just say thank you to our visitors who've come all the way from South Korea to this in Liverpool. It's a very long way. Everyone's suffered from jet lag, but we really appreciate the visit, and we'll hopefully reciprocate that as well. Patrick and I have done a couple of these sort of trips and things recently where we wanted to sort of give our hosts, as we've been visiting other people, sort of presents, and we've kind of settled on a set of presents in Geographic Data Science Lab, and we use this for a national conference that we ran as well. So what you've each got is a Liverpool West bin, pencil bin. And then inside it, you have a small fingerling. It's you know what it is? It's the flipper and banana. So for people who've not spent time in Liverpool, you might not know what that is. But it's kind of a city icon, and you'll see very large versions of these all around the city in different places. And it's a piece of sculpture which combines both the front of a lamb and the back of a banana. To this day, I'm not sure why that's the case.
We don't have any lambs.
But
It's up against genetic engineering.
Oh, interesting.
was that a high risk possibility? A lamb and a banana. Anyway, so we've got
We also, we also prepared if the we could come to we have you. Yeah, inside, I mean, there is biggest weekend.
Yeah.
If you come.
These might be a bit later.
There is some pages have the order and the pen and the USB. But that is the traditional Korean parents and made by
Okay, we'll come to the.
Gal. Not waiting, waiting.
It's very hard to get anything to find out. They don't fit things places anymore. Oh, got it. Ah, very nice. So we go. Oh, there we go. E-chain, that's good. And that's well, business card. Very nice, very nice. Good. So if anyone wants to have one of these, well, you've got to be extremely nice. It's the bachelor of the kids. Thank you very much. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's. Yeah.
We've got the final, you know, I wanted to introduce Professor Manley from University of Leeds. I think Ed and I are going to track back where Ed had been at when, at what time. And I think we overlapped maybe his PhD student, certainly when you were a PhD student, I was a postdoc at UCL. And his PhD was Town Chain in geomatical engineering. And then he was very briefly a postdoc from there, lecturer, and some spatial analysis at UCL, and then more recently a professor. Analytics at the University of Leeds. Yeah. So Ed's also involved in the CDRC, and obviously we collaborate and things with the Sherman as well. Over to Ed for your eyes.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks, to see you all in Liverpool. Right, apparently got to start. So, we'll be talking, I understand you've been talking mostly about the pandemic last few days, so I thought I'd present what we've been doing on the pandemic in the last, well, whenever it started a few years ago now, but my interest in mobility data for quite a long time, and I think during the pandemic, we're used to these kind of themes and graphs, but mobility data became quite central to a lot of understanding about what happened, during the pandemic. So, rather than just being something about transport and pretty boring and hard to explain, it became more about health and about the economy and the broader societal things. So I think that's what's quite interesting. Even mobility data used in like your daily slides, number 10, so it demonstrates sort of the value of the data. So the data I'm going to talk about today, right, okay. The data I'm going to talk today is about this sort of things that come from these kind of devices, apps, beacons, cards, voice cards, and smart cards, and everything like that. Sort of things that you probably talking already, sort of things that you've seen our team available. They are large, they're passively collected generally, usually space and time location data. And often, if you can get it, then it's a big generation. And what they allow us to do is no less than all bits of this we can show is that it's we can generate kind of aggregate and understanding the world. So you know, there are ratings here, but to get probably quite a lot of people are aware of biases when you're taking these data. But you'll be talking about those, right? We will to a certain extent, but there are certainly issues in terms of privacy, how we preserve privacy, and I think the data really, though, and many of you have seen this sort of data, sort of looks like it would sort of give a little point. An ID, its location, the time, and if you're lucky enough to say get an individual scale, we get data which tracks that individual in the past, so they've been previous to that point, which like things like speed, location. It'll give you forward other points which indicate things like clusters, which you can then interpret as maybe home locations or these activity locations. And you know, you add in your GIS data and you match it all up, and you end up with some indication of land use and where people are specific land use, out there in demography, some indication of noise in the data as well. I think it's all pretty obvious, you guys. And then you know, you have to have if there are multiple different people, you can start as you see more people, you can start to write different things. So this person is sort of stuck here. Where you know is that a delay, is that an unexpected delay in that person's trajectory, is both you know considering that other people usually refired. So these sorts of things you can start deriving from just the raw traces. And then once we have those traces, once we derive some insight into their behavior, we can then aggregate it to spatial units or to some kind of network. So that's the data we're dealing with. Now I'm going to talk about incredibly, in hopefully 40 minutes or so, talk about 4 different studies involving mobility and COVID. 2 of them relate to similar data that Patrick's talking about, regarding maps. One is some taxis, origin destination data, and one is something a little bit different from which I think is points to how the data transcend what we treat people doing. Okay, right. First study, household visitation. Now, I've got Patrick's comment really weird, like we don't care about what happened in, you know, very looking forward. And I feel a little bit like presenting stuff relating to COVID policy from 2020, but anyway, bear with me while I do talk about the past a little bit. What we're talking about here is household visitation. So, you know, we know COVID was very important. The important pathway of spreading COVID was mixing in closed spaces, and a lot of the sort of policies that were developed were around sort of reducing that. So things like what is it? Support bubbles, the rule of 6. These are these naming terms you know, probably like beneath in your brains, but these were the smorgasbord of British or English state policy that we had. But Christmas bubbles, Reddit stays, all this sort of stuff. And there was a lot of sort of talk in the media about adherence to policy, whether people were really sticking to it. And there were surveys that said, yeah, you know, we do, you know, we haven't really, I wear my mask all the time, and I don't mix with people, but all of those, all of the surveys are biased by, you know, who's filling in and how many people see. So until we've done this study, it wasn't really an understanding of how household visitation is ongoing or not. You know, how much people go to these. Google, Apple released data on movements to particular activity locations like parks and shops, and how much people staying there and houses, and less so how people will go to other locations. So I'll go through this study and sort of talk to you about that's quite this was just using spectrum data, similar to the data Geographic have access to, for example. We had it at the individual scale, and obviously you have to go through various steps to aggregate that data and access data as well. But effectively, we have access to about 1 million people traces between January 2020 and 2021. And, and a typical user might do that. You see, symbols, before, you've kind of clusters in space and a few other points, right? And we just did a pretty simple methodology, using DB scan on the individual level data to identify clusters of activity. All right, so we did, we used a clustering method to identify home and work locations, so key, most important locations, and two most important visit locations. And then we removed any points which related to stay points or in green space. And then we removed we isolated basically all the cases where people were visiting a site which was really resident away from any other point. So we were pretty certain that what we were left with after we've removed as much data as we possibly can are the points where people are visiting a location in a residential area. And those will not there, not their work. I'm not sure. So that's what we think we have. The sort of next step then obviously, and once you sort of put this into the process, is to aggregate it. So that process is it's simply just a sort of stunning and sort of normalization. We built it on a baseline from early 2020. So that was good. We had data pre-pandemic. So in the same way that Apple and Google were able to construct their baselines in a similar period, the first 8 weeks of 2020, basically, we could do the same. And we had a baseline for all of our levels of activity. So whether that was national, regional, and a different time period as well. And so we could analyze basically the extent of which people were, the proportion of people who were visiting other households for any space out there. Okay. So you've seen graphs like this all for every week, variations over time with indicating the quality. I mean, the top one is really anyone paying attention to. We will end in May 2021. But what we see is in start 2020, obviously we running the baseline. And when the first national lockdown occurs in March, we see its reduction in proportion indicator of what we've taken back. See a plummet basically, and then what's interesting is it slowly increases. So while there's no official change in policy, no end, the end of the full lockdown and the relaxation of the rules on alcohol visitation doesn't come until July, but you still see, even from probably about late April, there's a slow increase in people sort of relaxing, I guess, more likely to visit the house. And this sort of just continues throughout summer. You see a sort of peaks, but essentially you can track it through back to probably growing concern about the rise of the second wave. This is the impact of the second national lockdown, which was probably you can recall pretty ineffective. And then a sort of bigger reduction around the end of the year once the sort of London lockdowns came in place, and then the full extent of the lockdown. What's interesting, I guess, is another thing to point out is this increase. And this timed quite nicely with the vaccine rollout. So if you remember, it was Ballantyne's Day 2021, probably like giving you a PTSD here because you're remembering all these horrible things and like promises from the government. I think it was Ballantyne's Day 2021 where they aimed to get everyone vulnerable first everyone with vaccinated. And that pretty much aligned with this day. Now I'm not going to rule out problems with the data, we can probably talk about that, but there is a clear upward trajectory after that date. And I feel like also I was speaking to my mum and dad, and they were like, oh, on my iPad with them, and they're like, oh yeah, Susie's here. Wait, what? Why is someone in the house? That sort of conversation. I'm pretty sure in this period people weren't really, we're still mixing. The policy to allow more mixing came to action so clearly there was some kind of bounce back of activity in households. Anyway, We can obviously look at this as well spatially. This shows the regional variation. We've also got a breakdown by lockdowns. Essentially, and I can say this up here, London, actually, but you know, yeah, it's that was worth adherence to the policy in general. We can also look at different local authorities. Liverpool, I didn't actually choose it. Didn't have Liverpool in here. Going to stop. Quite interesting to see comparison. Somewhere like Leicester have an extended local lockdown, which did seem to have an effect. The grey is the national average, and this is the Leicester line. You can see there was a slower bounce back activity in households in Leicester, but actually, after the relaxation about the sort of counter. Whereas Liverpool actually say local than that national average. I'm not sure, maybe that's an indication of which being very socially conscious in Liverpool, right? But that's, you know, within something you can explore it by region. And then I'm just going back to this point about the vaccine rollout. I mean, we did test it as well about looking at the data as good as detailed we could. So this is the vaccine data, it was only available at regional scale. You know, and there is this nice link across the board between the vaccine rollout, which is showing the blue lines, and this sort of increase in activity in household. But you know, like all these things, never really. Okay, last two bits on this then. We looked at representation of space, to land up pretty nicely. This was using our household, our home location estimations. And we also looked at our comparison against Google mobility data by different activity types. And what I like about this is that, you know, it does show to be quite different to all of the other activities of patterns over time, but also some similarities. So here we've got, you know, we've got our sort of orange line, which is our data, our indicator, and all of the other types of activity. And you do see similar kind of peaks and troughs in the activity relative to Google data, which is nice. But we also see differences from something like a residential data. You know, it's really about a different kind of. So we think it adds something new to the discussion, or would have done if you cared about something. But that's you know that's that. So to wrap up the first of the 4 studies, then just to sort of say this is about highlighting how the spatial and temporal variation is possible limitation face that. But the limitations, so things that before, findings can only be indicative. We never really know what's going on because of what's actually happening on the ground, and we know these data are biased in terms of how they're generated in the phone to whose data being affected, why the data is affected when, and a lot of uncertainty about that. I think when we look at comparisons against ground truth or better data sets, then we can get some. So yeah, that's the first one. So moving swiftly on, in the interest of time. Okay. Right, working applications. This is something more recent we've been looking at beyond that work. And it's really about responses to post-pandemic times and how working patterns changed during the pandemic, and in particular interested in different groups and how different groups have been impacted by COVID at different points in time. So what we've done is look at the cubic data and spectral data again. We've identified some clusters of activity. So the processing is fairly straightforward. We're using the home location estimates. So in this case, actually provided by Spectris, so we're very similar to ours. Which for these. And we then, for each home location or each user for the home location, we've calculated how much people are traveling from their home location for every hour of the day. and then we interpolated that distance between every point we pick. So you for an individual, you might see, distance from home, starting with 0 in the early morning, and then springing up to 8 o'clock, bring up here 8 o'clock, and then reducing them on cooking. We just done a very simple calculation. Find that estimated for every unit. So taking that for all the users, essentially we have a vector of distances for every hour of the day for every user, and then we put it into use that vector in Kenyon's clustering to establish a membership and establish a set of clusters. So those clusters provide us with the bounds in which a different kind of activity will occur. So what we see are 5 different clusters of the whole process. We have a traditional commute cluster, so this is someone who leaves the house early in the morning, stays away from the house at a certain fairly fixed distance, and then comes home in the evening. Children away from the home, again, I mean, these are just average trajectories, we say about. Then we see shorter out of the home, we see that these trips are close to home, stay close to the home throughout the day. Groups that are out in the evening, those who stay at home who don't seem to move, and got highly mobile, who are out basically most of the day. So yeah, and then I think the out of the evening group as well seems to go further away from the house. So these are our clusters. They make sense, right? They look very straightforward. What we expect in this sort of data. But what's nice is you can start looking at it again over the course of the period of the pandemic. You can see how users move between groups. So in particular, the growth, you're looking again at this sort of time around April 2020. You see an increase in the proportion of users who are in the stay-at-home cluster, and the reduction in people who are going on traditional commute. We can see the stay-at-home cluster reduce quite a lot once we get even sort of July, August of the period. That seems to align with the health out. Which is also seems to suggest the people who are in the out in the evening group see higher as well. We see some kind of activity around Christmas, more short trips out of the house, less traditional commute, you'd expect. Interestingly, again, go looking at how that November lockdown wasn't very effective. You only see a small reduction in people who are going out in the evening, small increase in people staying at home. So not as much effect as you might hope. And then the rest of the period, things seem to stay like So that's all very well, but what we wanted to do with this bit of work is take a little bit further and look at some sort of explanation about what was underlying, the changes in customer membership beyond just COVID policy and temporal variant. So one thing we wanted to look at was deprivation. So very finally, talk. And we're looking at IMD, and really looking at the two facets of the IMD. Just looking at this sort of empirically, you can actually see how I don't remember exactly what this showed again, but this shows the proportion, the cluster. I don't know, let's think about it. Let me explain it wrong. It's the cluster proportion by it's by decile, yeah. But if I'm thinking about whether it's okay, I think it's for each local alpha area, Eunsun, right? Yeah. For each alpha, we've got the proportion plus a membership and an indicator. And essentially, in this sort of prior to the pandemic, what we saw were people in the higher end of the deprivation scale were more likely to get on commute. So people who were least deprived were part of the traditional commute cluster, and then the people who were most likely to stay at home were the lower end. Once we go into the pandemic, we see this sort of flip around, and actually the most deprived groups or the most deprived areas see more membership of the traditional commute group. So this particularly, not necessarily the first group, but the second, third groups are the highest amount of commuting travel during its second period during 2021. So within the pandemic. Whereas the stay-at-home group see more people at the upper end of the stay-at-home group. And then we see again more change once we get through to later in October 2021. See more of an established decline, a bit more return of activity towards our traditional commutes and reducing the amount of people staying at home. But there are still some thought persistence. So this pattern, relating, showing a fairly clear relationship between IMD and commuting behaviour, has not really returned even by. So this is probably matches our intuition that the richer groups are able to stay at home. So what we did then was take in some of these factors, so relating to IMD. What we looked at specifically were low income, access to services, in terms of primary barrier factors, and then we looked at other features about number of area deaths. Well, what we did was put this into a model to capture the effects of changing class of preference during the pandemic. So if I just show you some of the results, it might be easier for me to explain. So if we look at the result for the traditional commute group, what we see is that during each stage of the pandemic, different levels of effect of membership of this group. That as we said before, there's a lower proportion of the traditional commute in the early stages of the pandemic, which does increase throughout the time period. We see that the membership of this group is related to inversely related to low income. And then about the effect of geographic barriers and protecting people who have access to services is not clear in this cluster. We look at the stay-at-home group, we see obviously a higher membership the early parts of the pandemic, which is reducing. But we also see that the effect of income in the model varies during the course of the pandemic. So in the early days, we see higher income groups part of this group. In the middle of the pandemic, we see lower income group, low income groups at the start of the pandemic, and higher income groups in the middle of the pandemic, and then reducing towards the end of the pandemic. And we also see an effect from the presence of barriers. And then in this one, a highly mobile group, we see less effects from the stage of the pandemic, and then increasing effects from low income. So people, this is a bit of a story about this. The model outputs are kind of this one on the train, but they're quite complicated. So anyway, I think what we showed in this study is that there are temporal varying features, there are non-temporal varying features that are affected mobility. This cluster membership seems to sort of be a quite clear indicator of how different groups behave differently during the course of the pandemic. So it seems that certainly in terms of the groups who are involved in a commute, that varies during the course during the pandemic. At times they were in the early stages, they were maybe more with different people than there were in the later stages. But you know, I think there are many things we can still do this. So this is something ongoing. It's really the kind of stuff. And still more work to do that. That gives you a sense of where this works. All right. The other thing I want to talk about was new tax data. This is like a favorite data set. Many of us, you know, certainly teaching is openly available. It's regularly updated. It's pretty large. And a few years ago, I was playing with this data. I realized it has quite nice stuff on tipping. Every taxi journey's got a little tip next to it. And I've always sort of wanted to publish something on it, and so I was playing around with it again during relation to, you know, just keep yourself fresh and finding skills and stuff. And I thought we could look at it in terms of impact of COVID. In the end, actually, the tipping stuff didn't necessarily pay off, but there are some interesting findings in terms of, yeah, I think, yeah. We can look at the displacement demand, the variation in demand in taxis between the two time periods. So what I've done is look at pre-COVID, a week in pre-COVID, a few months in pre-COVID and a few months post-COVID. And what we see is, you know, obviously a massive reduction in so you go from 22 million journeys in 2019 to about 2 million journeys in 2020, so basically the same weeks. We see a reduction in the number of passengers per trip and a reduction in distance. And just to give you a sense of what's happening in New York, similar time periods to here, but they have quite a strong lockdown period from similar time in March to June. So we can look at that period, yeah, and look and sort of how see what people how people use that. And so you look at it over the course of the week. And what we've done here is just basically the proportion of travel for each time period within a week, the difference between that and community. So when you see blue, you see a higher proportion of travel in 2020 during the pandemic. And red is where there's less travel, where there used to be. And so basically, people have. Yeah, the amount of the trips that are going on in taxis during this pandemic period is much more concentrated on the daytime, right? You know, there's no more nighttime stuff happening. A lot of big reductions around your Saturday nights, Sunday morning kind of entertainment stuff. And maybe people are just trying to avoid public transport and taking for the necessary trips they do need to take during the daytime. They are, you know, trying to take care of it. Public transport is kind of, I think it's partly influenced in that period. So that's something we're like. We can also look at changes over space. So this shows the map on the right hand side shows how there was the blue areas where there was more trips in 2020 in the pandemic period. See far fewer trips around the hotels in Midtown, around here, and more trips actually in the suburbs, but particularly around hospitals. I mean, this may well have been just an artifact of data and aggregation, but there may have been something related to staff at the Kenyon hospital flying tax. And then you can also look at this by land use type as well, given the rich land use. You see, not surprisingly, reduction in trips to high bulk commercials and more trips to residential locations. So less commercial activity, less retail activity, and more activity. And the last thing is, because you know, I seem to be really interested in this payment stuff, is we just sort of stumbled across it. There's about the proportion of cash use. So this is, you know, within the data you can see, you know, how people pay, how much they pay, how much you know, part of the transaction cost. And you can see whether they pay cash or credit. And you can see in 2020, the proportion of people paying cash increased. Yeah, we're not really sure why. What was going on there? Right, good. Okay, last talk. That's the last project to present now. This one is just sort of demonstrating now about how we might apply the same sort of analysis, same processes within a completely different tech. In this case, an architectural technique in hospital. So this is actually it's a project which started as just before the pandemic kicked off. Some people we were working with long term, working with UCL hospital. They've been concerned about healthcare impact. And so we put together this study, which was funded and emergency funding by MRC. And what our part of the study was to look at the movement of that. So how can we derive understanding of the behavior from in the first instance what we individual. And the idea was to put around Bluetooth beacons in the hospital and like get people to carry around, cards or whatever badges to collect the data. But obviously, pandemic hit in earnest, and they said, no, you're not going to handle it. So what we did was actually sort of rethink this and that started to look at how we might use routinely collected data to derive indications of effect. And the questions the correct questions about the pending study, about the initial results, are who's facing the most risk, where are they facing risk, and how do we improve market forecasts to reduce the risk we have to go. So the data that we have to put together was a kind of this actually took about a year and a half to really pull together to final conclusion. But there are various cases around the hospital relating to how healthcare workers move. So that's the card access logs. So where they're tapping the card and indoors. There is a patient records. So how people interact with patients and where they interact with patients. That's all. That was without any special data. That was at least with an indication of the type of at the time. There's roster data, and then there's staff records as well. So different staff ID. We can also add to this staff testing. So in the end, we have for every user, every staff member, we have their ID, their COVID tests that we took part throughout the whole period, and then their locations at either bedside where they've met a patient, or as a direct. And you've got that safely, temporary. The other, apart from having to sort of build this whole index and putting all the data together and bring the system together, we also have to digitize the PDFs of the floors and annotate them to link this data with a sort of spatial indicator of the day and the room number with that. Anyway, we think it's worth it and certainly easier than going around putting beacons in that. And so we can then start, once we get the data, we can start looking at different patterns of activity in there. We're just sort of just releasing this data, just kind of accepting data, because how long the data to put together, but we can start seeing how different types of things happen. So we've got the amount of proportion of patient contacts, the number of door events, the number of healthcare workers who are working with patients in the hospital, and then use data as well. It's always similar trends to what we've seen before. We've got our similar kind of time periods, and we can basically do the same thing we've done with the other studies. Is look at baselines, variation over baselines, we can construct all these measures. All we're doing is in a slightly different setting. So we can look at this in a similar kind of activity over time, the heat maps, time periods, the days. We can look at variation over different different wards, so you can see that what can I put up here, but in some cases, the movement of the movement of healthcare workers increased in certain wards and decreased in others. You can obviously track it with and then we can look at this over space. And this is this shows the division of the ward into different regions. So the data this is actually without the bedside data. We're just using the card data to see the colors. And then here shows you can see each of those areas. And then we can start modeling, right? So what we need to do here is modeling the risk factors associated with capturing COVID. So we can take a positive COVID case, look at the behavior, look at the attributes of that individual, and look at their movement over the prior 2 weeks, and their interactions over the prior 2 weeks. I won't go through all the results, there's been too many again to go through already. What we do find is there is an effect of ethnicity. So this was something that came up in other studies with you here, that people who were BAME had a higher risk factor. We have found that people who worked more shifts have a higher risk factor, no surprise there, and more night shifts have an additional risk factor. Something we're not really very sure about why that is. And then different types of worker as well. So have different areas of varying levels of risk at different times of the pandemic. The physios, for example, were the most at risk during the first wave. But that changed later on. So quite a lot of different things going on. And you can pull out these charts, looking at the risk associated with all these factors, wards, which ward you're on has an effect, and who you interact with, how you interact with the patients. We essentially built this within a DAG framework, so I'm not going to go through it now, but the additional factors can be your character okay, all right. Okay, so this the point of putting this bit in was to emphasize how mobility data can be used outside of just geography and just spatial geospatial contexts. And in this case, we're doing it in the hospital, looking at direct impacts on healthcare workers. But at the same time, these data also have problems. We still don't know how people generate the data, when they generate it, when people just walk through a door because it's open, or really how people vary in terms of their PP influence. There's a lot of uncertainty even in the small context. But that's it. I mean, sorry, it's probably too much to go through in a certainly short period, but give you a flavour of what's going on in terms of different studies. So the first one, health augmentation and health data. Second one, occupational shifts and environment effect. And the graphics in those. Then we have to change some usage and finally, so I need to thank my co-authors who are listed on the left and the projects.
Thank you, Ed. I think it's just going to start compressing the video so we can get that training to Oxford. So